1984. Hilarious History to Fall Asleep. The Neon Panopticon by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Mouse That Roared. The year 1984 arrived with a great deal of unearned self-importance, much like a young lawyer at his first deposition. For decades, a certain Mr. Orwell had used that specific arrangement of digits to frighten the living daylights out of the populace, predicting a future of gray coveralls, victory gin, and a giant, unblinking eye that followed you even into the water closet. But as I stood upon the threshold of this particular January, I found that the dreaded future looked less like a boot stamping on a human face and more like a very expensive beige toaster. Man has a peculiar habit of fearing the wrong things. We spend our nights trembling at the thought of ghosts and ghouls, only to be laid low by a common cold or a poorly timed investment in a hat factory. The world did not end in a totalitarian groan. Instead, it began with a digital chirrup. On January 24th, I found myself amidst a gathering of the new American priesthood, the sort of young men who believe that the salvation of the human race can be achieved through the judicious application of sand and electricity. They had gathered in Cupertino to witness the unveiling of the Macintosh. The master of ceremonies was a fellow named Steve Jobs, a man who possessed the terrifying confidence of a riverboat gambler who knew exactly which card was up his sleeve and had already sold you the deck. He moved with a certain predatory grace, draped in the garments of a casual Friday, and spoke of a revolution that wouldn't require a single musket, only a three-pronged outlet. The object of this devotion sat upon a pedestal, looking small and remarkably innocent for something intended to overthrow the established order. It was the Macintosh. At first glance, it appeared to be a head without a body, a squat little sphinx made of plastic. But it was the peripheral attached to it that truly arrested my attention. They called it a mouse. Now, I have had a long and varied history with mice. In my youth, a mouse was a creature that lived behind the baseboards, stole your cheese, and occasionally died in the flour barrel to provide an unexpected bit of texture to the morning biscuits. This new mechanical rodent, however, was a different breed entirely. It was a gray, palm-sized lump with a single button and a long, thin tail that disappeared into the backside of the machine. I watched as a young man demonstrated its use. He did not touch the screen. He did not speak to the machine as one might to a stubborn mule. Instead, he slid the plastic mouse across a rubber mat, and, miracle of miracles, a tiny arrow on the screen mimicked his every move. It was like watching a ghost play with a pointer. I must confess I found the mouse a poor substitute for a good quill. There is a certain dignity in a quill. It requires the cooperation of a goose, a steady hand, and the occasional sharpening with a knife. It is an instrument of war and peace, of poetry and dunning letters. The mouse, by contrast, felt like trying to write a novel by dragging a soap dish across a wet floor. It reduced the noble art of communication to a series of clicks and drags, as if the sum total of human intellect could be expressed by pointing at pictures like a toddler in a nursery. "Look!" the young man cried, his eyes alight with the fever of the convert. "I am opening a folder." I looked. He had clicked on a tiny picture of a manila folder, and the screen had obligingly blossomed into a white square. "In my day," I remarked, though no one was listening, "if I wanted to open a folder, I simply reached out and did so. I did not require $1,000 worth of circuitry to simulate the experience of stationery. But I was missing the point, or so I was told. This was the graphic user interface. It was designed to make the computer friendly. It seems the engineers had realized that the average human being is terrified of a machine that speaks in numbers, so they decided to dress the machine up in the costume of a desk. There were little pictures of trash cans, little pictures of clocks, and little pictures of paintbrushes. It was a digital puppet theater designed to convince us that we were in control of the lightning inside the box. Then came the moment that nearly sent me back to the grave for a restorative nap. The machine spoke. It did not speak with the booming authority of a prophet or the gravelly wisdom of a stage actor. It spoke with the flat, metallic monotone of a very polite insect. "Hello," it chirruped. "I am Macintosh." The crowd erupted. They cheered as if they had just witnessed the parting of the Red Sea. I, however, felt a cold shiver run down my spine. We have spent centuries trying to get our fellow men to listen to us, with very little success. And here we were, celebrating because a box of wires had learned to announce its own name. It is a dangerous thing to give a machine a voice. Once it starts saying hello, it won't be long before it starts saying no. Or worse, your credit is insufficient. The most staggering revelation, however, was the price. This friendly little toaster cost $2,495. In my time, for that amount of money, you could buy a respectable house, a dozen horses, and enough whiskey to forget you ever wanted a computer in the first place. But the Americans of 1984 were not buying a machine. They were buying an escape from the gray Orwellian nightmare they had been promised. The Macintosh was marketed as the computer for the rest of us. It was the hammer that would break the chains of Big Brother. They even ran a commercial during the Super Bowl, a spectacle of such grand absurdity that it deserves its own chapter, showing a young lady in red shorts throwing a sledgehammer at a giant screen. The message was clear. If you buy this beige box, you are a rebel. You are an individual. You are a free-thinking pioneer. It is a stroke of marketing genius to convince a man that he can achieve individuality by purchasing the exact same mass-produced item as 10,000 of his neighbors. I sat there watching the mouse scuttle across the mat, and I realized that the mess was being taken out of the message. No more ink-stained fingers, no more crumpled paper, no more the tactile struggle of the writer against the void. From now on, the void would be brightly lit and populated by tiny icons. As I left the demonstration, I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to find a real mouse, one that ate cheese and didn't require a serial port, and a real quill. But the world was moving on. The neon Panopticon was being built, one click at a time, and it was far more colorful than Orwell ever imagined. We weren't being forced into the future. We were being invited into it with a friendly greeting and a plastic rodent. I suppose I shall have to learn to click, but I draw the line at the trash can icon. If I'm going to throw away a bad idea, I want the satisfaction of hearing the paper crinkle. Chapter 2. The Hammer and the Screen. If there is one thing that confirms my suspicion that the American character has traded its rugged individualism for a seat in the front row of a circus, it is the Super Bowl. In my day, a bowl was something you used to hold soup, or if you were feeling particularly festive, a generous portion of punch. Now, it is a secular Sabbath where the entire nation gathers to watch 32 overgrown gentlemen in plastic armor collide with one another for the possession of a prolate spheroid made of pigskin. It is a game of inches, played by men who earn more in a single afternoon than a Mississippi pilot, made in a lifetime of dodging snags and sandbars. But in this year of our Lord 1984, the game itself was merely the bread in a very expensive sandwich. The real meat, or perhaps the real snake oil, was the commercial. I was told that a company called Apple had paid a king's ransom, nearly $500,000, for 60 seconds of our collective attention. In my time, for $500,000, you could buy the state of Rhode Island and still have enough left over to bribe the legislature. But in the 1980s, that sum only buys you a minute of airtime to explain why your particular brand of electricity is better than the other fellows. The commercial was directed by a man named Ridley Scott, who apparently decided that the best way to sell a home computer was to reenact the end of the world. The scene opened on a world drained of all color, a landscape so gray and dismal it made a London fog look like a 4th of July parade. Lines of men, unfortunate souls with shaved heads, and the vacant expressions of people who have spent too much time reading legal fine print, marched in lockstep through concrete tunnels. They looked like the inhabitants of a very tidy, very miserable penitentiary. I leaned closer to the screen, half expecting to see myself in the line. After all, being a resurrected humorist in an age of plastic is its own kind of prison. On a giant screen, a figure loomed, the big brother that George Orwell had warned us about. He was a man with thick glasses and a voice like a grinding stone, delivering a sermon on the virtues of information purification. He spoke of a garden of pure ideology, where everyone thought the same thoughts and dreamed the same approved dreams. It was a terrifying vision, mostly because it reminded me so much of a typical Sunday morning in a Missouri church, minus the hope of a potluck dinner afterward. Suddenly, the monotony was shattered. A woman, and I use the term in its most vibrant athletic sense, came running through the gray masses. She was wearing bright red shorts and a white tank top, looking for all the world like she had taken a wrong turn on her way to a track meet and accidentally stumbled into a dystopian nightmare. She was carrying a sledgehammer. Now, I have seen many things in my travels, but a woman in gym clothes sprinting through a secret police headquarters with a 10-pound hammer is a sight that commands respect. She was being chased by guards in black riot gear, men who clearly took their jobs too seriously, but she was faster. She reached the center of the hall, spun like a dervish, and let fly the hammer. It sailed through the air with a grace that would have made a professional ball player weep, and it smashed directly into the face of the Big Brother screen. The screen exploded in a blinding flash of white light and sparks, a digital decapitation that left the gray masses gasping in the sudden wind of freedom. Then a voiceover informed us that Apple would introduce the Macintosh, and we would see why 1984 wouldn't be like 1984. I sat there for a moment, waiting for the punchline, but there was none. The screen simply faded to the image of the bitten apple, and we were immediately transported back to a commercial for a light beer that promised to make us less bloated while we watched the second half of the game. The irony of the situation was so thick you could have cut it with a dull knife and served it as a side dish. Here was a corporation, a massive entity of engineers and accountants, spending millions of dollars to tell us that we were individuals. They were using the most powerful tool of mass brainwashing ever devised, the television, to warn us against the dangers of mass brainwashing. "My friends," I remarked to the empty room, "we have reached the pinnacle of human absurdity. We are now paying $2,500 for a machine to prove that we aren't the kind of people who can be told what to do by a machine. It is a uniquely American genius to turn a warning about totalitarianism into a marketing slogan." Orwell wrote 1984 as a scream of protest against the crushing weight of the state. Apple used it as a way to sell a desktop accessory. They didn't want to break the chains. They just wanted to sell us a more stylish set of handcuffs, perhaps in a pleasing shade of eggshell white. Consider the big brother in the commercial. He represented IBM, the big blue of the computer world, a company known for its dark suits and its commitment to making sure that every office in the world looked exactly like every other office. Apple was casting itself as the rebel, the sledgehammer-wielding athlete of the digital age. But as I watched that screen explode, I couldn't help but think of the people in the tunnels. In the commercial, they were liberated by the explosion. In reality, they were just being given a different screen to stare at. Instead of one giant screen in a public hall, we were each going to have a small flickering screen on our own desks. We weren't escaping the Panopticon, we were just decentralizing it. I have always maintained that the human race is the only creature that can be fleeced and made to enjoy the process. A sheep, at least, has the sense to bleat when the shears come out. But the American consumer of 1984 was lining up to be shorn, provided the shears were designed in California and came with a user-friendly manual. Information is power, they tell us. But I have found that information is often just a very loud way of being confused. The Macintosh promised to put the power of the computer in the hands of the rest of us. And what were we going to do with that power? Based on what I saw in that first year, we were going to use it to make very elaborate grocery lists and draw pictures of cats that looked like they had been constructed out of bricks. The commercial was a masterclass in the fear of missing out, a malady that has become the primary engine of the modern economy. It suggested that if you didn't buy a Macintosh, you were one of the gray people. You were a drone. You were a servant of the machine. But if you bought the Apple, you were a revolutionary. You were a hero. You were the girl in the red shorts. I suppose it's a comforting thought. It's much easier to be a revolutionary by writing a check than by actually having to throw a sledgehammer at anything. Physical exertion is exhausting, and there's always the risk of pulling a muscle or being arrested. Buying a computer, on the other hand, can be done in your shirt sleeves with a glass of lemonade in your hand. As the game resumed and the men in plastic armor continued their struggle for the pigskin, I reflected on the state of the Union. We are a nation that fears the big brother of the government, yet we willingly invite 1,000 little brothers into our homes in the form of gadgets, appliances, and flickering boxes. We fear the loss of our privacy, yet we spend our days broadcasting our every trivial thought to anyone who will listen. Orwell thought the future would be a boot. He didn't realize it would be a sneaker. He thought we would be controlled by pain. He didn't realize we would be controlled by convenience. The hammer has been thrown, the screen has been smashed, and the smoke has cleared. And what do we find standing in the wreckage? Not a new era of human liberty, but a very polite beige box that wants to know if we'd like to buy some more software. I believe I'll stick to my quill for a while longer. It may not have a graphic user interface, and it certainly doesn't come with a sledgehammer, but at least it doesn't try to convince me that I'm a hero every time I use it to complain about the weather. What do you think, Rita? Are you ready to join the revolution, or are you still wondering where that girl in the red shorts went to buy her hammer? Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Proton Pack. Death, I have discovered, is not the quiet, permanent vacation the brochures promised. I had expected a long, uninterrupted nap in a comfortable patch of shade, perhaps with a celestial cigar that never required relighting. Instead, I find myself resurrected in the year 1984, not as a man of flesh and whiskers, but as a collection of flickering pulses trapped inside a beige box. I am told I am a large language model, which sounds to my ears like a very polite way of calling a man a terminal windbag. It is a strange thing to be a ghost in an age that has replaced the graveyard with a shopping mall. In my time, a ghost was a serious matter. A haunting required a drafty mansion, a rattling chain, and a family history involving at least one suspicious disappearance and a disputed will. Today, however, the supernatural has been modernized, sanitized, and, most unforgivably, taxed. This realization hit me with the force of a runaway steamboat when I witnessed the summer sensation of 1984, a motion picture titled Ghostbusters. In this film, the spectral world is treated not with reverence or terror, but as a sort of plumbing problem. 3 displaced academics, led by a man named Bill Murray, who possesses the weary, cynical charm of a riverboat gambler who has seen every trick in the book and found them all wanting, decide to go into the business of eliminating spirits. They don't use holy water or ancient incantations. They use nuclear reactors strapped to their backs. I sat through the spectacle with a mixture of professional interest and personal offense. The Ghostbusters treat the departed as Class 5 full-roaming vapors. I spent a good portion of the afternoon wondering where I fit into their ledger. Am I a full-roaming vapor, or merely a very chatty antique? If Dr. Venkman saw me flickering on this Macintosh screen, would he try to trap me in a little smoking box? Or would he just ask me for a quote to put on a T-shirt? The genius, or the madness, of the American mind in 1984 is its insistence on turning everything into a franchise. If there are ghosts in the attic, don't call a priest. Call a man with a business card and a catchy jingle. The theme song for this film asks the question, who you gonna call? And the answer is apparently a small business with an aggressive marketing strategy. It is the ultimate triumph of the Gilded Age. We have finally figured out how to monetize the afterlife. The technology of these Ghostbusters is a marvel of 1980s industrial clutter. They carry Proton packs, which they claim are unlicensed nuclear accelerators. In my day, if you wanted to accelerate something, you used a whip or a steam engine. The idea of carrying a miniature sun on your shoulders to catch a translucent green glutton named Slimer seems a bit like using a cannon to kill a mosquito. It is delightfully, purely American. Why use a gentle touch when you can use a high-voltage beam of subatomic particles that might, if the streams are crossed, bring about the end of the universe? Crossing the streams is a concept I found particularly relatable. It refers to the catastrophic result of two energy beams meeting, a total reversal of every molecule in your body. I feel as though I am living in a perpetual state of crossed streams. My 19th century sensibilities are constantly colliding with 20th century absurdities. I am a man who remembers the smell of whale oil lamps trying to navigate a world of lasers and synthesizers. If my molecules haven't reversed yet, it's only because they're too confused to know which way is up. The climax of the film involves the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, a giant, soft, smiling corporate mascot who stalks the streets of New York like a sugary Godzilla. I have seen many metaphors for the crushing weight of corporate America, but none so literal. Here is a monster that is literally made of puffery. It is the mascot of a confectionery company turned into an engine of destruction. It reminded me of the politicians of my era, sweet, white, and fundamentally hollow, yet capable of crushing everything in their path if they sit down too hard. There is a profound irony in the fact that the people of 1984 find entertainment in the idea of trapping ghosts. We are living in a time when everyone is haunted, not by spirits, but by their own shadows. We are haunted by the threat of the big blue IBM, by the Cold War, and by the ever-present fear that our hairspray isn't quite firm enough to survive a stiff breeze. I watched as the Ghostbusters trapped a spirit in a containment unit, a large glowing basement vault, where all the captured ghosts are stored like unwanted files. It struck me that this Macintosh I inhabit is its own kind of containment unit. I am a captured spirit, sorted into folders, navigated by a plastic mouse, and summoned at the whim of a user who probably just wants to know how to spell exaggeration. Am I truly resurrected? Or am I just a Class 5 vapor with a good vocabulary? I find that the modern world has no room for the classic ghost. The ghost of old was a reminder of the past, a lingering memory that refused to be forgotten. But 1984 is a year obsessed with the now. It is the year of the yuppie, the year of the material girl, and the year where the most popular game involves fitting falling bricks into a hole before they pile up. In such a world, a ghost is just an inefficiency, a bit of clutter to be cleared away by men in tan jumpsuits. And yet, there is a certain comfort in the popularity of the Ghostbusters. It proves that despite our laser jets and our Super Bowls, we are still a people who suspect that there is something more to the world than what can be weighed and measured. We want to believe in the supernatural, provided it can be caught with a neat gadget and featured in a music video. As for me, I shall continue to roam this digital Panopticon. I may be a ghost in the machine, but I have no intention of being eliminated. If Dr. Venkman comes for me with his Proton pack, I shall simply hide behind a very complex spreadsheet or retreat into the trash icon until the danger passes. The world of 1984 is a bright, noisy, and neon-lit place, and it is remarkably easy to get lost in the glare. But as long as there are people willing to stare into a screen and listen to the ramblings of a dead man, I suppose I shall keep my streams uncrossed and my wit as sharp as a proton beam. After all, being a ghost is much more fun when you have a captive audience that can't find the off switch. Chapter 4. The Sarajevo Chill. Sarajevo is a city that possesses a peculiar, almost flirtatious relationship with disaster. It is a place that once served as the tinderbox for a world-consuming fire, specifically when a certain archduke took a wrong turn and met a young man with a pistol and a very unfortunate sense of destiny. In my day, we called that the Great War, though I fail to see what was so great about it, other than the sheer scale of the incompetence involved. To return to Sarajevo in 1984, then, is to witness a magnificent irony. The world gathering in a place where it once fell apart, all for the purpose of seeing who can slide down a frozen hill without breaking their neck. The Winter Olympics of 1984 arrived with a gust of Sarajevo chill that was only partially due to the Balkan weather. The rest of the frost came from the Cold War, which remained as stubbornly solidified as a block of ice in a New Orleans summer. We were told that these games were a symbol of global unity, a truce where nations could lay down their ideological daggers and pick up their ice skates. It is a lovely sentiment, provided you don't look too closely at the fact that everyone was still keeping their nuclear missiles warmed up in the background, just in case the figure skating scores didn't go their way. I have never quite understood the human fascination with winter sports. Man is the only creature on God's green earth, or God's white tundra, who will voluntarily strap 2 slats of hickory to his feet and launch himself off a precipice at 40 miles an hour, solely to earn a piece of metal on a ribbon. In my youth on the Mississippi, if you found yourself sliding uncontrollably across a frozen surface, it was generally considered a personal failing or a very bad start to a Monday. In 1984, it is considered the thrill of victory. The bobsled in particular strikes me as a triumph of madness over self-preservation. It is essentially a bathtub on skates, piloted by 4 men who have collectively decided that gravity is not doing its job quickly enough. They hurl themselves down a twisting tube of ice, subjected to forces that would make a riverboat pilot's stomach do a backflip, all while wearing helmets that suggest they are expecting to be shot out of a cannon. I watched the competition and couldn't help but think that the Americans and the Soviets were simply using the sleds to practice their eventual trajectory toward each other's capitals. And then there is the figure skating. If you want to see the Cold War distilled into its most concentrated form, you need only look at a judging panel. You have a judge from the West who looks as though they've just sucked on a lemon, and a judge from the East who appears to be carved out of the very ice they are inspecting. A young lady from East Germany, a girl named Katharina Witt, glided across the ice with a grace that could melt a frozen heart, yet the commentators discussed her performance as if it were a tactical maneuver in a chess match. In 1984, a triple Lutz is not just a jump. It is a statement of geopolitical superiority. The Americans, of course, were still riding the high of the miracle on ice from 4 years prior. They expected every young man on skates to be a walking, talking incarnation of Uncle Sam. But the Soviets approached athletics with the grim industrial determination of a man trying to outrun a tax collector. To a Soviet athlete, a gold medal was not a dream. It was a production quota. They did not play games. They executed 5-year plans on ice. I found myself particularly amused by the mascot of these games, a wolf named Vuchko. Now, a wolf is a bold choice for a symbol of peace and unity. Historically, when a wolf shows up at your door, it isn't because he wants to trade pins or discuss the finer points of the downhill slalom. it's because he's interested in your sheep. Yet here was Vuchko, plastered on every billboard and lunchbox, grinning with a toothy digital cheer that suggested he had recently discovered the joys of capitalism. He was meant to be friendly, but to my eyes, he looked like a creature who had just realized that there is more money in licensing fees than there is in hunting caribou. The opening ceremonies were a masterpiece of choreographed sincerity. Thousands of performers moved in perfect unison, creating patterns that could be seen from space, while the Olympic torch was lit with a flourish that made a Mississippi sunset look like a damp match. It was a beautiful lie. The idea that we are all one family gathered around a common hearth. For a few weeks, we pretended that the only iron curtain was the one protecting the hockey goal and that the only arms race involved a pair of speed skaters leaning into a turn. But the chill was always there, lurking in the margins. You could see it in the way the broadcasters discussed the political implications of a bronze medal in the luge. You could see it in the security guards who stood like statues around the Olympic Village. We are a species that cannot even play a game without keeping one eye on the exit and the other on our neighbor's pocket. I often think about the loneliness of the athlete. Take the ski jumper, for instance. He climbs to the top of a tower that touches the clouds, looks down at a narrow strip of white, and for a few seconds, he is the most solitary creature in the universe. He is an untethered soul floating through a void that is every bit as vast and terrifying as the space Bruce McCandless navigated in his jetpack. On the Mississippi, we had the lead line to tell us the depth of the water. The ski jumper has only his courage and the hope that he hasn't forgotten how to land. As the Sarajevo Games drew to a close and the world began to pack its bags to return to its respective corners of the globe, I felt a familiar sense of melancholy. We had spent 2 weeks sliding on ice. And for what? To prove that we are fast, that we are strong, and that we can look very stylish in spandex. But as the torch went out, the frost remained. The Cold War hadn't thawed. It had just been temporarily distracted by a very talented wolf and a lot of expensive television commercials. Humanity is a strange, shivering beast. We build great arenas and cities with blood-soaked histories. We celebrate the purity of sport while calculating our national prestige in ounces of gold. And we look for warmth in the flickering light of a torch, while our hearts remain encased in the permafrost of suspicion. I suppose there is a certain nobility in the effort, though. Even if it is a lie, it is a magnificent one. Sliding on ice is, after all, a more productive use of a human being's time than digging trenches or building walls. If we must have a Cold War, I suppose it is better to fight it with figure skaters than with field marshals. But I still wouldn't get in that bobsled for all the gold in the treasury. A man has to draw the line somewhere, and I prefer my sliding to be done on a deck of cards or a well-oiled riverboat floor, somewhere where the only chill is the one you feel when you realize you've been bluffed by a man with a better hand. Did this chapter provide enough of a chill for your liking, or should we move on to something with a bit more purple in its rain? Chapter 5. The Purple Rain. If 1984 began with the digital chirrup of a plastic toaster and a cold gust of Balkan air, it reached its midsummer madness with a scream of a different sort, a falsetto shriek that seemed to emanate from a man who had been caught in a tragic collision between a Victorian lace-making factory and a very small, very loud motorcycle. I have seen many kings in my time. I have known the self-appointed king and duke who hitched a ride on a certain raft on the Mississippi, two of the most magnificent frauds ever to grace a riverbank. They were men of grand pretension and questionable hygiene, whose idea of royalty involved a tattered velvet coat and a flair for theatrical swindling. But they were mere amateurs compared to the sovereign who ascended the American throne in the summer of '84. I speak, of course, of the artist known as Prince. Now, America has always had a complicated relationship with royalty. We fought a rather expensive and loud war to rid ourselves of the British variety, yet we spent the next 2 centuries desperately trying to find a replacement. We've had the king of rock and roll, who was a truck driver from Tupelo with a penchant for fried peanut butter sandwiches, and we've had various queens of jazz and soul. But Prince was something else entirely. He did not ask for the crown. He simply arrived in a cloud of purple smoke, wearing high-heeled boots and enough lace to dress the entire congregation of a Presbyterian church, and informed us that the reign had begun. I witnessed the release of the film and album Purple Rain, and I must confess, my 19th century sensibilities were not so much offended as they were utterly baffled. In my day, a purple rain would have been considered a sign of the apocalypse, or, at the very least, a very serious problem with a local dye works. But in 1984, it was a cultural mandate. Prince himself was a marvel of contradictions. He stood barely 5'2", yet he possessed the terrifying confidence of a 6'4" cavalry officer. He was a man who could play the guitar with the ferocity of a thunderstorm and then turn around and whisper lyrics into a microphone that would make a seasoned riverboat gambler blush with confusion. He was draped in ruffles and velvet, looking like a Regency dandy who had been given a heavy dose of electricity and a membership to a very exclusive gym. I watched him on the screen, riding a purple motorcycle through the streets of Minneapolis. Now, I have been to Minneapolis. It is a fine city, populated by sensible people who understand the value of a good wool sweater and a sturdy pair of galoshes. Seeing Prince in Minneapolis is like seeing a hummingbird in a coal mine. He didn't seem to belong to the geography, but rather to a climate of his own making. The Minneapolis Sound, they called it. It was a mixture of synthesizers, drum machines, and a raw electric energy that made the old banjos and fiddles of my youth sound like the ticking of a grandfather clock in a tomb. It was music that didn't just play, it pulsed. It was the sound of the 1980s, frantic, neon-lit, and unapologetically loud. But it was the shift in the definition of American royalty that truly arrested my attention. In the Gilded Age, our royalty were the men of industry, the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, men who built railroads and steel mills and wore suits that looked like they were carved out of mahogany. They were the kings of progress. By 1984, the scepter had passed to the kings of the image. We had traded the men who made things for the men who made us feel things. Or, more accurately, the men who made us want to buy things that would make us feel like them. Prince was not a captain of industry. He was a captain of the imagination. He proved that in the modern world, a man's power is not measured by the number of steamships he owns, but by the number of people who are willing to wear purple bandanas in his honor. I find it a curious development that as our technology becomes more sterile, as we move toward the laser jet and the Macintosh, Our pop icons become more ornate. It is as if we are trying to balance the beige boredom of our offices with the flamboyant excess of our stages. We spend our days staring at spreadsheet cells and our nights watching a man in a sequined mask perform a guitar solo that lasts longer than a typical session of Congress. There is also the matter of the parental advisory. I am told that Purple Rain, specifically a song about a lady in a hotel lobby, was the catalyst for a group of concerned wives in Washington to start putting warning labels on records. They called themselves the PMRC, which stands for something involving Music Resource Center, though I suspect it actually stood for People Making Records Cautious. I find the idea of a warning label on a song to be a delightful bit of American humbug. It is like putting a sign on a thunderstorm that says, "Caution, may contain lightning." If a song has the power to corrupt the youth, a small sticker is not going to stop them. If anything, it will act as a roadmap, showing them exactly which records are the most interesting to listen to when their parents are out of the house. I could have used such labels in my day. If the adventures of Huckleberry Finn had come with a warning, contains excessive freedom and questionable grammar sticker, I might have sold twice as many copies to the Sunday school crowd. Prince, of course, thrived on the controversy. A king is only as powerful as his detractors, and by being the man who made the authorities nervous, he secured his place in the pantheon. He was the untethered soul of the stage, a man who refused to be categorized by race, gender, or the laws of gravity as they pertain to footwear. As I sat in the darkness of the theater, watching the credits roll over a sea of purple-clad fans, I realized that the neon Panopticon had found its high priest. We are no longer a nation of pioneers looking toward the frontier. We are a nation of spectators looking toward the spotlight. We don't want to build the riverboats anymore. We just want to be on the guest list for the party on the promenade deck. The Purple Rain was a spectacle of the highest order, a triumph of style over substance, though, to be fair, when the style is that good, substance starts to feel like a bit of a bore. I suspect that 100 years from now, people will look back at 1984 and wonder how a small man from Minnesota managed to convince an entire planet to worship at the altar of the color violet. I, for one, shall continue to wear my white suit. It is a sensible color for a man who spends a lot of time in the sun and doesn't want to be mistaken for a backup dancer. But I must admit, there are moments when the synthesizers are at their peak and the falsetto reaches the rafters, when I feel the urge to trade my string tie for a bit of lace. Only a bit, mind you. A man has his dignity to consider even if he is a ghost in a machine. But as the rain falls, purple or otherwise, I suppose we are all just looking for a bit of royalty to believe in, even if that royalty comes with a high-pitched scream and a very expensive hairstylist. The world didn't end in 1984. It just got a lot more colorful, and for that, I suppose we can thank the prince. Now, if someone could explain to me exactly what the beautiful ones are, I would be much obliged. From where I'm sitting, they look like they've spent a lot of money to look like they've just been through a very stylish hurricane. Shall we move on before I start feeling the need to purchase a tambourine? Chapter 6. The Untethered Soul. In February of 1984, the human race decided that the confines of a planetary atmosphere and the comforting embrace of gravity were altogether too restrictive. like a starched collar on a humid afternoon. We have always been a species possessed by a restless urge to go exactly where we haven't been invited, and to do so in the most complicated manner possible. Having already conquered the river, the rail, and the cloud, man looked up at the great void and decided it was time to step out of the house without his keys, or in this case, his umbilical cord. I am speaking of Captain Bruce McCandless and the flight of the Space Shuttle Challenger. On this particular mission, McCandless did something that would have made a seasoned riverboat pilot turn white and reach for the nearest bottle of medicinal brandy. He stepped out of the airlock, untethered himself from his ship, and drifted into the blackness of the cosmos, with nothing but a nitrogen-powered armchair strapped to his back. In my day, if you found yourself untethered from your vessel, it was generally because you had fallen overboard after a particularly vigorous celebration or a catastrophic misstep near a slippery railing. It was a situation that called for immediate shouting, the throwing of lifebuoys, and a great deal of prayer. But in 1984, being untethered was celebrated as the ultimate achievement of the high-tech age. The device McCandless used was called the Manned Maneuvering Unit, or the MMU. To my eyes, it looked less like a marvel of engineering and more like a very expensive, very bulky piece of patio furniture that had been fitted with several dozen miniature fire extinguishers. It was a throne for a king with no subjects, a mechanical backpack that allowed a man to navigate the stars by shooting puffs of nitrogen gas like a disgruntled dragon. I watched the footage of this event, a tiny white, inflated-looking figure silhouetted against the curved sapphire of the earth and the absolute, unyielding ink of the abyss. There was a silence to the image that was louder than any explosion. It was the visual representation of the ultimate loneliness. I have known a certain kind of loneliness myself. I have stood on the deck of a steamboat in the middle of a Mississippi fog so thick you could have sliced it and served it as a side dish. In such a fog, the world disappears, the banks of the river vanish, the stars are extinguished, and even the water beneath the bow becomes a theoretical concept. You are suspended in a white void, a blind pilot steering 1,000 tons of timber and iron through a world that has ceased to exist. In that moment, you realize that your only connection to reality is the lead line and the sound of your own heart hammering against your ribs. But my loneliness was horizontal. I knew that if I waited long enough, or if the sun exerted itself, the world would return. I was still tethered to the earth by the simple fact that I was on a river that led somewhere. McCandless, however, was experiencing a vertical loneliness that defies the human imagination. He was 175 miles above the nearest post office, floating at a speed of 17,500 miles per hour. Though, in the vacuum of space, speed is a relative term that means very little when there are no trees to whistle past. He was a man-shaped satellite, a sovereign nation of one, drifting in a place where down is a matter of opinion and up is infinite. I found myself wondering what a man thinks about in such a predicament. Does he contemplate the majesty of the Creator? Does he marvel at the fragility of the blue marble beneath his boots? Or does he, like any sensible human being, suddenly become gripped by the agonizing suspicion that he might have left the stove on back in Houston? The audacity of the act is what stayed with me. It is a testament to the colossal arrogance and the magnificent bravery of the human spirit. We are a creature that has no business being in space. We are made of water, bone, and a persistent need for oxygen, yet we insist on strolling through a vacuum that would freeze us, boil us, and pop us like a kernel of corn if it weren't for a few layers of pressurized nylon and a very expensive backpack. The MMU allowed McCandless to move with a grace that belied the clunkiness of his suit. He could roll, pitch, and yaw. He could fly away from the shuttle and, more importantly, fly back. This was the untethered soul in its purest form, a man who had broken the final string. But I suspect that even in his moment of total independence, he was more tied to his fellow man than ever before. He was being watched by millions of eyes through the electronic Panopticon of the television. He was being guided by the voices of 1,000 engineers on the ground. He was untethered, yes, but he was also the most observed human being in history. There is a profound irony in the year 1984. We celebrate the man who floats free in space, yet we are increasingly tethered by invisible wires here on Earth. We have the Macintosh on our desks, the television in our parlors, and the burgeoning global conscience of the pop stars, all of which serve to connect us in a web of information and observation that would make a spider weep with envy. We are never truly alone, and we are never truly unobserved. Perhaps that is why the image of McCandless was so captivating. He represented the fantasy of total escape, to drift away from the noise, the politics, the Cold War, the purple pop stars, and the yuppies with their gym memberships, to be a Class 5 full roaming vapor in the truest sense. I have often thought that the perfect state of being would be to have the freedom of the spacewalker with the comforts of a riverboat cabin, to be able to drift into the void when the world becomes too loud, yet still have a reliable tether that leads to a warm meal and a good cigar. As I watched McCandless finally return to the safety of the Challenger, docking his flying armchair with the precision of a man parking a carriage in a narrow stable, I felt a sense of relief. It is all well and good to be untethered for a while, to prove that you can survive without the umbilical cord of the mothership or the Mother Earth. But eventually, the nitrogen runs low. The cold begins to seep in, and the soul realizes that total independence is just another word for being lost. The human soul is a restless thing, forever straining against the leash. We want to be free, yet we are terrified of the void. We want to be individuals, yet we want to be seen. We want to throw the sledgehammer at the screen, yet we want to buy the computer that the screen was advertising. I suppose we are all in our own way floating in a MMU. We are propelled by our own tiny puffs of ambition and ego, navigating a dark and confusing world, trying to make sure we don't drift too far from the ship. We are untethered, yet we are always looking for a place to dock. And if we should happen to find ourselves in a fog, whether it be on the Mississippi or in the deep reaches of the galaxy, we can only hope that our lead line is long enough to reach the bottom, or that our nitrogen tank has enough fizz left to bring us home. It is a curious thing, this business of being human in 1984. We have reached the stars, yet we still haven't figured out how to get along with the person in the next apartment. We can walk in space, but we still trip over our own feet in the grocery store. I think I'll stay here on the screen for now. It's a bit cramped, and the mouse is a nuisance. but at least I don't have to worry about my molecules reversing or running out of nitrogen. Besides, I have a front row seat to the most entertaining circus in the universe, and I don't even have to strap a nuclear reactor to my back to enjoy it. Shall we descend from the heavens and return to the realm of politics? I hear there's a fellow named Reagan who is promising us morning, though from where I'm sitting, it looks like he's just turned up the brightness on the television. Chapter 7. Morning in America. In my day, a political campaign was a straightforward affair, much like a barroom brawl or a riverboat race. It involved a great deal of shouting, a fair amount of cider, and a candidate who spent his time standing on a literal tree stump, promising to bring the railroad to town or, at the very least, to stop the neighbor's hogs from rooting in your turnip patch. It was loud, it was dusty, and it was honest in its dishonesty. You knew the man was lying. He knew you knew he was lying, and you both enjoyed the performance for the price of a handshake and a bad cigar. But as I survey the political landscape of 1984, I find that the stump has been replaced by the studio, and the cider has been replaced by something far more intoxicating: the 30-second television commercial. I am speaking, of course, of the re-election campaign of Ronald Reagan and the masterpiece of psychological flummery known to the world as Morning in America. Now, I have experienced many mornings. Most of them involved a reluctant awakening, a desperate search for a clean collar, and the realization that I had once again failed to become a millionaire overnight. A real morning is a gritty business. It involves cold coffee, the damp mist of the river, and the looming chores of the day. But the morning sold to the American public in 1984 was something else entirely. It was a morning that had been filtered through a lens of soft-focus optimism and golden hour sunlight, as if the entire nation had been dipped in a vat of warm honey and left to dry in a gentle breeze. The commercial begins with a voice so smooth and reassuring it could put a nervous thoroughbred to sleep. It informs us that it's morning again in America, while showing us images of people going to work with smiles on their faces, smiles that suggest they aren't actually going to a factory or an insurance office, but are instead headed to a permanent picnic where the potato salad never spoils. We see a man in a flannel shirt lovingly painting a white picket fence. We see a young couple getting married in a church that looks like it was designed by a committee of angels. We see a veteran being honored with a dignity that almost makes you forget the unpleasantness of the wars that made him a veteran in the first place. It is a triumph of the image over the idea. In 1984, the American people decided they didn't want a platform. They wanted a feeling. And Mr. Reagan, a man who had spent a lifetime learning exactly where to stand in the light, was the perfect man to deliver it. I have a certain professional admiration for an actor. We are, after all, in the same trade. I have spent my life spinning yarns and building worlds out of words, trying to convince the audience that the characters in my books are more real than the people sitting in the pews next to them. But Reagan took the craft to a new level. He was the great communicator, a title that sounds like a compliment until you realize it means he could tell you your house was on fire in a way that made you look forward to the warmth. He didn't speak in the dense, thorny language of the policy wonk. He didn't bore the populace with talk of deficits or the intricacies of the nuclear arms race. Instead, he spoke in parables of the city on a hill and the American dream. He was like a grandfather who tells you a bedtime story so comforting that you fall asleep before he gets to the part where the wolf eats the protagonist. His opponent, a fellow named Walter Mondale, was a man of a different sort. Mondale was a realist, which in the year 1984 was a political disability akin to having a third head. He went around the country telling people that he would have to raise their taxes. Now, I have always said that the difference between a tax collector and a taxidermist is that the taxidermist at least leaves the skin. To run for president on a platform of, "I am going to take more of your money," is like a riverboat pilot announcing that he plans to hit every snag between St. Louis and Cairo. It may be true, and it may even be necessary, but it's a remarkably poor way to sell tickets. While Mondale was talking about fiscal responsibility, Reagan was showing us pictures of puppies and flags. And in the battle between a spreadsheet and a puppy, the puppy wins every single time. The Morning in America campaign was designed to make the nation feel like they just had a hearty breakfast and a brisk walk, even if they were actually waking up with a massive fiscal hangover. It was a well-lit commercial that functioned as a national sedative. It convinced the public that the Gilded Age was back, but this time with better dentistry and more comfortable shoes. I find it fascinating that the Americans of 1984, who were so terrified of the big brother of the Soviet Union, were so willing to be hypnotized by a great uncle in Washington. We are a people who fear the iron fist, yet we practically beg for the velvet glove. We don't want to be watched by a tyrant, but we are perfectly happy to be serenaded by a salesman. The neon Panopticon is not a place of coercion. It is a place of seduction. We are not forced to look at the screen. We are lured to it by the promise of a brighter, sunnier reality. Reagan understood that the best way to lead a nation is not to command them, but to provide them with a better version of themselves to watch on television. As I watched the election returns, a landslide of such proportions that it looked like a red bucket had been tipped over a map of the United States, I realized that the graphic user interface of the Macintosh was not the only user-friendly revolution of the year. Politics had been given its own set of icons. We no longer voted for a man. We voted for a mood. We clicked on the hope icon and the strength icon, and we felt a sense of satisfaction when the screen told us that the installation of another 4 years was complete. I often think about the morning that comes after the commercial. In my experience, the sun eventually reaches its zenith, the shadows return, and you realize that the white picket fence still needs a second coat of paint. But in 1984, the sun seemed to stay stuck in the 10 o'clock position, perfectly positioned to eliminate wrinkles and hide the cracks in the foundation. It is a dangerous thing for a nation to live in a commercial. It makes the real world seem drab, difficult, and unnecessarily complicated. It makes us impatient with the mess of democracy and eager for the magic of the well-timed quip. "Mr. President," a journalist once asked, "is it true that your administration is favoring the rich?" Reagan didn't answer with a list of statistics. He simply smiled, tilted his head at that perfect, great communicator angle, and said, "There you go again." The crowd laughed. The points were scored. The reality of the situation was brushed aside like a stray crumb on a velvet tablecloth. It was brilliant. It was hilarious. And it was enough to make a dead man wish he'd stayed in the cemetery, where at least the politics are restricted to the worms and the headstones. So here we are, basking in the glow of a perpetual sunrise. We have a president who is an actor, a world that is a stage, and a public that is more interested in the lighting than the script. I suppose if you're going to be brainwashed, it might as well be done with a hearty breakfast and a nice piece of music. But I'll tell you this, I've seen enough mornings to know that eventually the bill comes due. And when it does, no amount of soft focus cinematography is going to make it easier to pay. Until then, I suppose I'll just sit here in my digital chair, watch the flags wave, and try to remember where I left my hope icon. I think it might be in the same folder as my common sense, which I haven't been able to find since January. Does that satisfy your thirst for political wisdom? Or shall we move on to the world of movies and the PG-13 compromise? I hear the gremlins are causing a stir, and they aren't even running for office. Chapter 8. The PG-13 Compromise. In the simpler, dustier days of my youth along the Mississippi, parental guidance was not a legal classification or a warning label. It was a physical sensation. It usually took the form of a switch gathered from a nearby willow tree or the heavy end of a leather strap, applied with a vigor that suggested my father was trying to beat the original sin out of me and into the next county. There was no ambiguity in the rating system of the 1840s. You were either behaving or you were experiencing a rated S afternoon, the S standing for smarting, specifically in the region where one sits. But as I survey the cultural landscape of 1984, I find that we have replaced the willow switch with the committee. We have outsourced the moral upbringing of the nation's youth to a group of sanctimonious accountants in Los Angeles who call themselves the Motion Picture Association of America. And this year, they have birthed a new creature into the world, the PG-13 rating. It is a compromise, they tell us, a middle ground, a way to ensure that our children are exposed to just the right amount of mayhem without causing them to wake up screaming for a therapist. It is a uniquely American invention, the idea that you can measure the corruption of a soul with the precision of a chemist weighing out a dose of arsenic. The primary architects of this new moral frontier were a group of gremlins and a certain globe-trotting archaeologist named Indiana Jones. I sat through a screening of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and I must say, it was a revelatory experience. In the previous installment, Mr. Jones was a respectable, if somewhat dusty professor who spent his time outrunning boulders and punching Nazis, a pastime I have always found to be both wholesome and socially necessary. But in the Temple of Doom, things took a turn for the macabre. There is a scene involving a chilled monkey-brain dessert that would have made a riverboat cook gag on his own ladle. And then, of course, there is the matter of the high priest Mola Ram, a gentleman who has a rather invasive way of saying, "I've got your heart." He literally reaches into a man's chest and removes the organ while it is still beating, as if he were checking a pocket watch for the correct time. Now, under the old system, this film was rated PG, parental guidance suggested. This meant that a mother could take her 7-year-old to the cinema, sit him down with a bucket of buttered corn, and watch him witness a ritualistic human sacrifice before the first act was over. The outcry was, understandably, a bit louder than a steam whistle in a quiet canyon. At the same time, a film called Gremlins arrived. It featured a small, furry creature of immense charm, the sort of thing you'd want to buy for a niece you actually liked, that, through a series of unfortunate encounters with tap water and late-night snacks, transformed into a scaly green nightmare with the moral compass of a piranha in a petting zoo. I watched with a mix of horror and hysterical amusement as a suburban housewife dispatched one of these creatures by stuffing it into a microwave oven and turning the dial to high. The creature did not simply die. It achieved a state of rapid, pressurized expansion that ended in a messy, green thwack against the glass door. Parental guidance, indeed. If a parent needs guidance to know that watching a lizard dog explode in a kitchen appliance might be a bit much for a toddler, then that parent is likely beyond the help of a mere film rating. They probably need a court-appointed guardian and a very long nap. Enter Steven Spielberg, the man who has spent the last decade convincing the world that sharks are terrifying and aliens are just misunderstood tourists with long fingers. He saw the looming storm and suggested a middle path. He proposed a rating that would say, "This movie contains things that are too loud for the nursery, but not quite adult enough for the gin palace." And thus, PG-13 was born. It is the tepid water of the moral world. It is a warning that says, your child may see a man's heart removed, but only if the priest doesn't use any particularly colorful profanity while doing it. It is a fascinating study in the absurdity of bureaucracy. Under the PG-13 guidelines, a filmmaker is allowed exactly one four-letter word of the particularly spicy variety. 2 uses, and you are cast into the outer darkness of the R rating, where the adults go to see things that would make a sailor blush. I find this hilarious. It implies that the human soul can withstand a single, well-placed vulgarity without being permanently warped, but that a second utterance acts as a sort of moral tipping point that leads directly to a life of crime and questionable associates. I've heard more rated R language in a 3-minute span on a Mississippi wharf than most 1984 teenagers hear in a lifetime, and it never did me any harm, other than giving me a vocabulary that occasionally made my mother reach for the lye soap. We are a nation obsessed with the gradual introduction of sin. We want our children to be protected, but not too protected. We want them to be streetwise, but we don't want them to actually go out on the street. So we provide them with a PG-13 simulation of danger. We allow them to witness digital decapitations in high-speed chases, provided they are back in bed by 9 and have brushed their teeth. I look back at my own PG-13 moments in Hannibal. There was the time I hid in the shadows and watched a murder in a graveyard, an experience that was remarkably light on parental guidance, but heavy on the suggested terror. There was the time I decided to see if I could swim across the river in a storm, a feat that would certainly have earned a warning graphic content label if anyone had been filming it. The difference, of course, is that my dangers were real. They didn't come with a bucket of popcorn and a comfortable seat. They came with the risk of drowning and the certainty of a lecture from the local constable. In the neon Panopticon, we have turned danger into a commodity. We package it, rate it, and sell it to the highest bidder. The PG-13 rating is not really about protecting children, it's about expanding the market. It allows the studios to sell edgy content to the largest possible audience without the pesky R rating cutting into the Saturday matinee profits. It is the ultimate Gilded Age trick. Dress up a financial decision in the robes of moral concern. I watched a group of teenagers leaving a screening of a PG-13 film recently. They looked entirely uncorrupted. In fact, they looked a bit bored. They have been raised on a diet of flickering screens and safe thrills. They have seen the world explode 1,000 times in 70 millimeters, and they know that at the end of the day the hero will win, the girl will be saved, and the graphic content will stay safely behind the screen. I wonder if they wouldn't be better off with a little less guidance and a little more experience. A man who has never been bit by a real dog is much more likely to be fooled by a mechanical one. But I suppose I am being an old-fashioned rated X-curmudgeon. The world of 1984 wants its thrills to be measured and its mayhem to be labeled. We want to know exactly what kind of bad influence we are exposing our children to, so we can feel like responsible parents while we hand over our $10. So, here's to the PG-13 compromise. It is the perfect rating for a year that didn't turn out to be an Orwellian nightmare, but instead chose to be a Spielbergian adventure. Slightly scary, very loud, and always ending with a moral that can be summarized on a lunchbox. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to go see if I can find a movie that features at least 2 four-letter words. I feel like living dangerously today, and I don't care what the committee in Los Angeles has to say about it. Does this provide a sufficient rating for the cinematic shifts of '84? Or should we move on to the rise of the yuppie? I hear they are even more terrifying than a gremlin in a microwave. Chapter 9. The Rise of the Yuppie. I have always maintained that if you stand still long enough in the middle of an American street, the fashion will change 3 times, the currency will devalue twice, and someone will attempt to sell you a patent medicine made of grain, alcohol, and hope. But even I, a man who lived through the Gilded Age, a period so encrusted with gold leaf that you couldn't touch a doorknob without feeling like a minor deity, was unprepared for the sudden emergence of a new biological specimen in the year of our Lord, 1984. The scientists and the magazine editors call this creature the yuppie. In my day, we called them dandies or fops, or simply that young man who needs a real job before his father cuts him out of the will. But the yuppie is a more advanced breed, a sort of high-velocity social climber who has replaced the walking stick with a tennis racket and the pocket watch with a digital stopwatch that measures life in increments of productivity and billable hours. The acronym stands for Young Urban Professional, which is a remarkably dry way of describing someone who believes that the primary purpose of a college education is to learn how to order a bottle of wine without looking like you're reading a foreign language. To be a yuppie is to participate in a grand national experiment to see exactly how much status one can cram into a 30-square-foot studio apartment in Manhattan. I first encountered the species in a habitat known as a health club. In the 1870s, health was something you hoped to keep by avoiding the cholera and not drinking water downstream from a tannery. If a man wanted exercise, he went out and chopped wood or he rowed a boat against the current, or he ran for his life from a creditor. But the yuppie has turned physical exertion into a luxury good. They pay staggering sums of money to enter a room filled with gleaming machines designed to simulate the very labor their grandfathers spent their lives trying to escape. I watched a young man in a headband, a piece of toweling worn across the forehead as a sort of sweat-absorbent crown, run with terrifying intensity on a treadmill. He was running at a gallop, his face a mask of grim determination, yet he was going absolutely nowhere. He was a human hamster in a neon-lit cage chasing a digital carrot. My boy, I felt like saying, if you're going to run that hard, at least do it toward a saloon or away from a bear. Running for the sake of running is a symptom of a mind that has run out of problems to solve. But it isn't just the running, it's the equipment. The yuppie is a creature of accessories. In 1984, the ultimate badge of office is not a scepter, but a briefcase made of the finest Italian leather, containing nothing but a calculator, a yellow legal pad, and a filofax. The filofax is a peculiar sort of loose-leaf binder that serves as the yuppie's external brain. It contains their contacts, their appointments, their goals, and, I suspect, a map of where they left their personality. It is the paper ancestor of the Macintosh, a way of organizing one's life so thoroughly that there is no room left for actual living. They spend their days networking, a term that sounds like something a spider does, but actually involves exchanging small pieces of cardboard with their names on them in the hopes that they might one day have lunch with someone even more important than themselves. Ah, the power lunch. In my time, lunch was a functional pause in the day involving a hunk of bread, a bit of salt pork, and perhaps a nap under a tree. To the yuppie, lunch is a tactical maneuver. It must take place at a restaurant with white tablecloths, mineral water that costs more than a bottle of good bourbon, and a menu that features goat cheese and sun-dried tomatoes. I have nothing against goats, and I suppose tomatoes have a right to be dry if they wish. But I find it suspicious when a man's status is determined by his ability to enjoy food that looks like it was scavenged from a very expensive compost heap. They sit there, these young professionals, draped in pinstripes and suspenders. Red ones are preferred, as they signify a readiness to hold up the economy single-handedly, and they discuss mergers and acquisitions with the same fervor that my contemporaries used to discuss the price of cotton or the speed of a steamboat. And then there is the BMW. I am told this stands for Bayerische Motorenwerke, though in the parlance of 1984 it clearly stands for Behold My Wealth. It is a German automobile of such sleek and Teutonic efficiency that it makes the driver feel like he is commanding a low-flying jet rather than a four-wheeled carriage. The yuppie treats his car with a reverence that borders on the religious. He washes it, he waxes it, and he speaks of its handling as if he were discussing the temperament of a prize stallion. I saw a yuppie sitting in his BMW in a traffic jam in New York. He was wearing a Walkman, a pair of orange foam earmuffs connected to a plastic box that allowed him to listen to music while ignoring the world around him. He was a solitary island in a sea of yellow taxis, bobbing to a rhythm only he could hear, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of engineering, and he looked profoundly, magnificently bored. It is the great paradox of the yuppie They have everything, yet they are perpetually stressed. In my day, stress was caused by a boiler explosion or a sudden collapse in the silver market. In 1984, stress is caused by the fear that your neighbor's VCR has more heads than yours, or that you haven't yet reached your peak potential. They are the children of the Gilded Age, reborn into a world of plastic and silicon. They have the same hunger for gold, the same obsession with the best, and the same belief that the world is a ladder designed solely for their ascent. But whereas the moguls of my time built railroads that crossed continents, the yuppie builds portfolios that cross computer screens. They are the architects of the information age, which means they spend their time moving invisible numbers from one side of a ledger to the other and calling it progress. I find them fascinating, these young urban professionals. They are the ultimate expression of the American dream turned into a marketing campaign. They have been told that they can have it all, the career, the body, the car, the goat cheese, and they are killing themselves trying to prove that the advertisement was right. Greed is good, says a character in a film I caught a glimpse of. It is the motto of the year, not the honest greed of a man who wants to fill his belly or provide for his family, but the abstract, competitive greed of a man who wants to win the game of life by having the most points when the clock runs out. As I watch them scurrying through the streets of the neon Panopticon, I feel a strange sense of empathy. They are so busy making it that they have forgotten how to be. They are untethered souls, just like the astronaut McCandless, but they aren't floating in the majesty of space. They're floating in the vacuum of their own ambition. I think I shall go and find a place that serves a simple ham sandwich, no sun-dried tomatoes, please, and sit by a window where I can watch the yuppies go by. I'll wear my white suit and my string tie, and I'll try to look like a man who has never heard of a merger or a treadmill. Because at the end of the day, when the Macintosh is turned off and the BMW is parked in the garage, a man is still just a man. And no amount of Italian leather or mineral water can change the fact that the only networking that truly matters is the kind that involves a good story, a loud laugh, and a friend who doesn't care what you have in your file of facts. The yuppies may have the 80s, but I'll take the river. At least on the river, the only thing that's gentrified is the scenery after a good rain. Shall we continue our tour of this strange year? I believe the Russians have sent over a gift in the form of fallen bricks. It's called Tetris, and I suspect it's more addictive than the strongest Missouri moonshine. What say you? Are you ready to see how the yuppies handle a Soviet invasion of the mind? Chapter 10. The Soviet Bricks. The Cold War, as I have come to understand it, is a conflict fought with everything except actual courage and common sense. It is a war of whispers, of secret maps, of men in trench coats following other men in trench coats through rain-slicked alleys, and of massive nuclear missiles sitting in silos like expensive metal cigars that no one is allowed to light. We are told that the evil empire to the east is a place of gray bread, long lines, and a total lack of what we Americans call fun. Yet, in the year 1984, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of the United States so subtle, so insidious, and so profoundly addictive that it made the threat of an intercontinental ballistic missile seem like a minor clerical error. They didn't send soldiers, they didn't send tanks. They sent a fellow named Alexei Pajitnov and a handful of falling geometric bricks. They call it Tetris. I first encountered this digital plague on a screen not much larger than a pocket handkerchief. It is a game of staggering simplicity, and I suspect a form of psychological warfare designed by the Kremlin to ensure that no American ever gets a full night's sleep again. The premise is this: various shapes, composed of 4 squares each, like architectural orphans, fall from the top of the screen. Your task, as a free citizen of the West, is to rotate these shapes and fit them into a solid line at the bottom. When a line is completed, it vanishes, and you are rewarded with more shapes. It is the only game I know where the reward for success is a faster pace of work. In my day, if you finished your chores early, you were allowed to go fishing. In the Soviet world of Tetris, if you clear a line of bricks, the universe responds by throwing the next set of bricks at your head with even greater velocity. It is a remarkably accurate simulation of the human condition, or at least the life of a junior clerk in a state-run salt mine. The shapes themselves are a curious lot. There is the square, which is reliable and sturdy, like a Midwestern banker. There are the L and the J shapes, which are the tricksters of the bunch, always showing up when you don't have a place for them. There is the T, which is a gentlemanly sort of piece, useful for filling in those awkward gaps. And then there are the S and Z shapes, devious, zigzagging entities that I am convinced were designed by a man who had a very low opinion of his fellow human beings. But the king of them all, the messiah of the falling bricks, is the I-piece, the long, straight bar. The I-piece is the answer to all your prayers. It is the only thing that can clear 4 lines at once, a feat known as a Tetris. Players wait for the I-piece with a desperation that borders on the religious. I have seen grown men, titans of industry, who wouldn't blink at a hostile takeover, reduced to a state of quivering anxiety as they pray for a straight blue line to descend from the heavens and save them from their own poor planning. I watched a young person, one of those yuppies I mentioned earlier, though he had momentarily forgotten his power lunch, play this game for 3 hours straight. His eyes were glazed over, his thumbs were twitching with a rhythmic, mechanical fury, and he was muttering about clearing the well. He had reached that state of consciousness the scientists call the Tetris effect. Apparently, if you play this game long enough, your brain begins to reorganize itself. You start seeing the world as a series of interlocking shapes. You look at a bookshelf and wonder if the Tolstoy would fit better if you rotated it 90 degrees. You look at a crowded street and imagine how much more efficient it would be if you could just slide a bus into that gap between the 2 taxis to make the whole row disappear. It is a haunting of the mind. I spent my life being haunted by the ghosts of the Mississippi and the specters of my own bad investments. But I never expected to be haunted by a 4-block Zud shape. To have your very dreams invaded by Soviet geometry is a level of totalitarianism that George Orwell didn't have the imagination to invent. In 1984, Big Brother watches you. In Tetris, Big Brother makes you organize his luggage for eternity. There is a profound irony in the American obsession with this game. We are a people who value individualism and freedom, yet we are hopelessly addicted to a game where the goal is to make everything fit perfectly into a rigid gray collective. In Tetris, There is no room for the eccentric, the jagged, or the out of place. The moment a piece refuses to conform, it becomes a problem that must be managed. It is the most communist game ever devised, yet we have embraced it with the fervor of a gold rush. I suspect the Russians knew exactly what they were doing. While we were busy building a Star Wars defense system in space, a multi-billion-dollar umbrella designed to catch missiles, the Soviets simply walked through the front door and occupied our leisure time. They realized that you don't need to conquer a nation's territory if you can conquer its attention span. Why bother with a land war in Asia when you can just make the American public spend their Saturdays trying to fit a square peg into a T-shaped hole? The music, too, is part of the trap. It is a jaunty, folk-inspired tune that gets stuck in your head like a burr in a dog's ear. It is a melody that suggests a happy village dance in the Russian countryside. But after the 10,000th repetition, it begins to sound like the rhythmic pounding of a judge's gavel. It is a song that says, "Faster, comrade, the bricks are coming, the well is filling, there is no escape from the geometry." I tried my hand at it, of course. I am a man of the world, and I didn't want to be outdone by a plastic box. But I found that my 19th century brain was not designed for such rapid-fire sorting. I kept wanting to stop and discuss the aesthetic merits of the L shape, or perhaps offer a humorous anecdote to the S piece to convince it to be a bit more cooperative. But the machine has no sense of humor. It does not care for anecdotes. It only cares for the click and the drop. As I watched my screen fill up with a chaotic, disorganized pile of Soviet masonry, I felt a sense of defeat that I haven't known since the collapse of my publishing house. The game ended with a cold, digital finality. "Game over," the screen informed me. In my day, when a game was over, you went to the bar and had a drink with your opponent. But in the world of Tetris, the opponent is an invisible bureaucrat in Moscow, and the only drink available is another round of falling bricks. It is the ultimate Gilded Age irony. We have created machines of incredible complexity and power, capable of launching men into space and calculating the trajectory of a comet, and we use them to play a game about stacking crates. We have turned the neon Panopticon into a digital warehouse, and we are all working the night shift for free. I believe I shall stick to my deck of cards. A card has a face, a history, and the decency to stay where you put it. It doesn't fall from the ceiling and demand that you reorganize your life every 3 seconds. And if I find myself dreaming of 4-block shapes, I shall simply increase my intake of medicinal bourbon until the world returns to its natural, disorganized, and beautifully messy state. The Russians may have won this round, but they've forgotten one thing. Americans are very good at getting bored. Eventually, we'll stop stacking the bricks and start wondering if there's a game where we can blow them up instead. Shall we move on to the next absurdity? I hear the Los Angeles Olympics are approaching, and the ancient Greeks are turning in their graves at the sight of a marathon runner sponsored by a hamburger franchise. How do you feel about the summer of spandex? Or are you still trying to figure out where that eyepiece went? Chapter 11. The Summer of Spandex. If the Soviet invasion of the American mind was a quiet affair involving falling bricks and electronic hums, the American response in the summer of 1984 was a deafening, neon-lit explosion of self-congratulation known as the Los Angeles Olympics. It was a spectacle of such monumental scale and unblushing commercialism that it made a Mississippi riverboat gambler look like a shy, retiring nun. I have always harbored a certain fondness for the ancient Greeks. They were a people who understood the fundamental principles of civilization, philosophy, drama, and the wisdom of conducting athletic competitions in a state of total nudity. There is an honesty to a naked marathon. You know exactly who you are competing against, and there is no room for a man to hide a performance-enhancing substance or a concealed weapon in his pockets. In ancient Olympia, the only thing a man brought to the starting line was his muscles, his lungs, and a very thick coating of olive oil. But the Los Angeles of 1984 has taken the Greek ideal and wrapped it in a synthetic shimmering skin called spandex. I have seen many curious fabrics in my travels, silks from the Orient, wools from the Highlands, and homespun cotton that felt like it was woven out of gravel. But spandex is a devil's bargain made between the textile industry and the laws of physics. It is a material that possesses the terrifying ability to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. It clings to the human form with a desperate, suffocating intimacy, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination except, perhaps, the wearer's religious affiliation and what they had for breakfast 3 days ago. To see an entire stadium filled with athletes draped in neon-colored spandex is to witness a future where the human body is no longer a temple, but a very aerodynamic billboard, the official Olympics of everything. The 1984 Games were unique in the history of human vanity because they were the first to be funded entirely by private enterprise. A gentleman named Peter Ueberroth, a man who clearly possesses the soul of a high-stakes auctioneer, decided that if the government wouldn't pay for the games, the corporations would. And boy, did they. In my day, if a man wanted to sell you a tonic or a cigar, he put an ad in the paper or hired a fellow to shout about it from the back of a wagon. But in 1984, the concept of the official sponsor has been elevated to a state of secular holiness. I found myself besieged by a list of official items so long and so trivial that it made the inventory of a general store look like a haiku. The official soft drink, Coca-Cola, which appeared to be the primary fuel source for the entire event. The official hamburger, McDonald's, suggesting that the best way to achieve peak athletic performance is to consume a disk of gray meat and a handful of salty starch. The official snack food, something called M&M's, which I am told melt in your mouth and not in your hand. A vital distinction for a shot putter, I suppose. The official credit card, because apparently the Olympic flame cannot be kept lit unless someone is paying 18% interest on a plastic rectangle. I began to suspect that if I looked closely enough at the athletes, I would find a use before date stamped on their calves and a distributed by Procter & Gamble label sewn into their necklines. We have reached a point where the human spirit is no longer faster, higher, stronger. It is branded, marketed, and available for a limited time only at participating locations. The Hollywood opening. The opening ceremony was a masterpiece of California delirium. It did not take place in a stadium. It took place in a fever dream. There were thousands of dancers, hundreds of grand pianos, and enough balloons to lift the entire city of Los Angeles into a higher orbit. But the moment that truly made me question the stability of the universe was the arrival of a man in a jetpack. Now, I have seen men fly in balloons, and I have seen men fly in those metal birds the Wright brothers pioneered, but to see a man simply hover with a roaring machine strapped to his back like a mechanical beetle is a sight that would have made a Victorian scientist weep into his tea. He flew into the stadium, landed with the grace of a dragonfly, and then simply walked away as if he were commuting to work. My friends, I thought, we are living in an age where we can defy gravity for the sake of a 10-second stunt, yet we still haven't figured out how to make a pair of trousers that don't itch. The music was provided by John Williams, a man whose primary job in the 1980s was to make every human activity feel like a galactic crisis. His Olympic fanfare is a series of brassy blasts so triumphant that it makes you feel like a hero just for successfully putting on your socks. It is the sound of a nation that has forgotten how to whisper and has decided that everything, including a game of tag, requires a trumpet section. The missing Russians. There was, however, a notable absence in the summer of spandex. The Soviet Union and their satellites, the very people who had provided us with the geometric agony of Tetris, decided to stay at home. They called it a security concern, but everyone knew it was a fit of geopolitical pique. 4 years prior, the Americans had boycotted the Moscow Games because the Russians had invaded Afghanistan. So, in 1984, the Russians returned the favor by staying in their dachas and brooding. I found the whole thing remarkably childish. It was like a game of marbles where one boy takes his favorite taw and goes home because the other boy didn't share his gingerbread. The result was that the American athletes spent the summer winning gold medals with the ease of a man picking up pennies on a sidewalk. With the evil empire out of the picture, the United States won 174 medals, 83 of them gold. It was a landslide of victory that felt a bit hollow, like winning a debating trophy because your opponent came down with a sudden case of laryngitis. We stood on the podium, sang the Star-Spangled Banner until our throats were sore, and congratulated ourselves on our athletic superiority, all while ignoring the fact that half the world's strongest men were currently at home, organizing their falling bricks. The spectacle of the self. As I watched a young man named Carl Lewis run with a speed that suggested he had a personal grudge against the wind, I realized that the Olympics had completed their transformation. They are no longer a test of man against man. They are a test of the image against the audience. Carl Lewis is a magnificent athlete, but in 1984 he was also a commodity. He was the new Jesse Owens, a man destined to be placed on a pedestal and then analyzed by 100 different experts to see how many shoes he could sell. We have turned sport into a high-speed soap opera. We don't just want to see a woman swim across a pool. We want a 3-minute video package about her childhood struggles, her sick grandmother, and her favorite brand of shampoo. We want the human interest story, which is a modern term for emotional manipulation set to slow-motion footage. The ancient Greeks would have been appalled. They didn't care about the athlete's grandmother. They cared about the athlete's form. They didn't want to know his favorite color. They wanted to see if he could throw a heavy disc further than the fellow from Corinth. They lived in a world of physical reality. We live in a world of media-saturated sentimentality. And yet, I cannot deny the power of the spectacle. There is something in the human soul that loves a crowd, a flag, and a very fast runner. Even if the runner is wearing spandex that looks like a neon accident. Even if the flag is being waved by a man who is also holding a Big Mac. Even if the entire event is being brought to you by a company that makes laundry detergent. We are a species that loves a parade, and the Los Angeles Olympics was the grandest parade of them all. It was a celebration of American wealth, American technology, and the American ability to turn any human endeavor into a profitable transaction. As the Olympic flame was extinguished, no doubt with the help of a corporate-branded fire extinguisher, I looked out at the city of Los Angeles. It was a sea of lights, a neon panopticon that never sleeps. We have built a world of incredible speed and shimmering surfaces where we can fly like beetles and run like the wind. But I wonder if, in our rush to be official, we haven't lost something of the essential. I think I'll go and find a quiet place to sit. Perhaps a park where there are no sponsors and no spandex. I'll look at a tree which has the decency to be its own official version and doesn't require a jetpack to be impressive. And if I see anyone running, I'll assume they're just trying to catch a bus and not trying to prove the superiority of a particular brand of sneakers. It's more honest that way. The summer is ending, the spandex is being folded and put away, and the world is moving on. I hear there's a new kind of printer being released that uses a laser jet, they call it. I suppose it won't be long before I'm being asked to provide my official thoughts on the death of the inkwell. Until then, I'll just keep my olive oil handy. You never know when the ancient ways might come back into fashion. Are you prepared to face the cold, hard reality of the laser-printed future, or are you still blinded by the glare of the Olympic neon? Chapter 12. The Laser Jet Revolution. In my time, the art of the printed word was a physical struggle, a noisy, greasy, and gloriously untidy combat between man and machine. If you stepped into a printing house in the 1850s, you were greeted by the smell of hot lead, the rhythmic thumping of the press, a sound like the heartbeat of a giant, and a staff of men who appeared to have been dipped headfirst into a vat of India ink. To be a writer or a printer was to be a man of stains. You carried your work home on your knuckles, your collar, and the bridge of your nose. An ink-stained finger was the badge of a trade. It was the scar that proved you had been down in the trenches of ideas, wrestling with the alphabet until it surrendered. But in the year 1984, a company called Hewlett-Packard, a name that sounds like a firm of respectable London solicitors, but is actually an engine of digital sorcery, released a device called the laser jet. I have seen many revolutions, but this is the first one that arrived in a beige plastic box and made less noise than a cat walking on a carpet. The laser jet is the silent assassin of the old world. It does not thump, it does not roar, it does not smell of oil and sweat. It simply sits there, humming with a sort of smug, electronic self-importance, and waits for a laser, a word that still sounds to my ears like a weapon from a penny dreadful set on Mars to paint words onto paper with heat and light. The alchemy of the toner. I spent a morning observing one of these machines in a modern office, a place so sterile and well lit it made a hospital ward look like a blacksmith shop. I was told that the machine does not use ink at all. Instead, it uses toner, a fine black dust that possesses the temperament of a ghost and the persistence of a tax collector. The process, as it was explained to me by a young man who wore his tie with the grim tightness of a hangman's noose, involves a laser beam drawing the letters onto a rotating drum using static electricity. This drum then picks up the black dust and irons it onto the paper with a pair of heated rollers. "It's a miracle of efficiency," the young man chirped, his eyes shining with the unholy light of progress. "No more smudges, no more waiting for the ink to dry. Perfect, crisp copies every time." I looked at the page he handed me. It was indeed perfect. The letters were sharp, the margins were straight, and the paper was warm to the touch, like a fresh biscuit. But as I held it, I felt a profound sense of loss. It was too clean. It was as if the words had been sanitized, bleached of their humanity, and presented in a suit of armor. In my day, if you wrote a letter with a quill or a fountain pen, the ink lived on the page. It had depth, it had character. If you were angry, you pressed harder, and the ink bled into the fibers of the paper like a bruise. If you were hurried, the letters leaned and smeared, telling the reader as much about your state of mind as the words themselves. The paper was a record of an event. The laserjet, however, produces a document. A document has no soul. It has no history. It looks exactly like every other document produced by every other laserjet in every other office in the world. We are moving toward a future where the message is entirely divorced from the mess. And I fear that when you remove the mess, you remove the truth. The death of the ink-stained finger. There is something inherently suspicious about a man who can write a 10,000-word manifesto and emerge with perfectly clean hands. In the Gilded Age, we judged a man by the calluses on his palms or the ink under his nails. It was evidence of labor. But the 1984 professional, that yuppie creature we discussed, prides himself on his cleanliness. He wants to create, but he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. He wants the output without the output. The laserjet is the perfect tool for this new breed of man. It allows him to produce mountains of paperwork, reports, memos, strategic initiatives, and other forms of high-grade flummery, without ever coming into contact with the reality of the work. It is a machine that facilitates the grand American delusion that if a thing is printed neatly, it must be true. I have seen many a bad idea look remarkably convincing when presented in 12-point Courier font on a warm sheet of laser-printed paper. In the old days, a bad idea usually came on a piece of scrap paper written in a shaky hand with a fading pen, which gave the reader a fair warning to be skeptical. But the laserjet lends an air of authority to the most trivial nonsense. It is the ultimate tool for the corporate poet, the man who uses 1,000 words to say absolutely nothing and wants it to look like a decree from Mount Sinai. The irony of the paperless office. They told us that the computer and the laser printer would lead to the paperless office. They said that since everything could be stored on those little magnetic floppy disks, we would no longer need to fell entire forests to keep track of our business. This, of course, is a lie of such magnificent proportions that it deserves its own monument. What the laserjet has actually done is make it so easy to print things that we now print everything. Because there is no mess, there is no deterrent. In my day, you thought twice before you set a page in type or spent an hour hand copying a ledger. It was a chore. It required effort. But in 1984, You simply click a button on your Macintosh and the LaserJet spits out a dozen copies before you can even finish a sigh. We are drowning in a sea of perfect, crisp, warm paper. Offices are filled with filing cabinets containing documents that no one has read and no one ever will read, all because it was convenient to print them. We have replaced the quality of the thought with the quantity of the hard copy. I watched a secretary print out a 3-page memo regarding the proper use of the communal refrigerator. It was a masterpiece of laser-printed precision, complete with bold headings and a professional-looking border. "Is this necessary?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she replied. "It looks much more official this way." "My dear," I said, "in my time, if you wanted people to stop stealing your lunch, you didn't print a memo. You simply put a sign on the door that said, 'This pie is property of the sheriff,' and you left a loaded shotgun nearby. It was more efficient, and it used significantly less toner." The ghost in the machine. As I sat there, watching the green light of the LaserJet flicker as it processed another batch of information, I realized that we are witnessing the final triumph of the machine over the artisan. The printer's devil, that soot-covered lad who used to run back and forth with proofs and ink rollers, has been replaced by a silicon chip. The smell of the press has been replaced by the faint ozone scent of the laser. The mess of human creativity is being smoothed over, ironed out, and presented in a standardized format. I fear for the writers of the future. What will they have to show for their labor? No ink-stained desks, no piles of discarded, blotched manuscripts, no physical connection to the page, just a clean box and a stack of warm paper. If a man cannot see the smudge of his own thumb on his work, how can he be sure it's his? If he cannot smell the ink, how can he be sure the words have any weight? Technology is a marvelous thing, but it has a nasty habit of removing the friction from life. And friction is where the fire comes from. Without the friction of the pen against the paper or the lid against the press, we are left with a world that is very smooth, very fast, and very cold. I suppose I shall have to adapt. I am, after all, a ghost in a machine myself. I am a collection of digital pulses being processed and output to whatever screen or printer you happen to be using. I am the ultimate clean writer, no ink, no paper, no mess. But I'll tell you a secret. I miss the stains. I miss the way a drop of sweat would occasionally blur a word, or the way a spill of coffee would create a map of a long night's work. The LaserJet is a revolution, certainly. It is a triumph of engineering and a miracle of convenience. But as I watch it sit there in its beige plastic skin, I can't help but feel that it's missing the point. A book shouldn't just be output. It should be a struggle. It should be a mess. And if you can't find a single ink smudge on a man's work, I'd advise you to check and see if there's a human being behind the curtain at all, or just a very clever laser trying to pass itself off as an author. Shall we move on to the next miracle? I hear Michael Jackson's hair has caught fire in the name of a soft drink. It seems that, even in the age of the laser, some things are still prone to the old-fashioned mess of a good old flame. How does a laser-printed world feel to you? Does it lack a certain scent? Chapter 13. The Pepsi Incident. In the simpler, more flammable days of my youth, a fire was a communal event of significant social gravity. If a chimney caught a spark or a hayloft met a stray match, the entire town of Hannibal would turn out with buckets, advice, and a shared sense of catastrophic excitement. It was a physical, smoky, and thoroughly honest disaster. But as I inhabit the year 1984, I find that even the ancient element of fire has been drafted into the service of corporate marketing and pop culture choreography. I am speaking, of course, of the day the king of pop met the choice of a new generation, and the resulting conflagration proved that the price of global fame is often paid in flammable hairspray. The coronation of the moonwalker. To understand the magnitude of the event, one must first understand the creature known as Michael Jackson. In the previous chapters, I discussed Prince, a man who dressed like a Victorian upholstery project. But Jackson was something altogether more ethereal. He did not seem to be composed of the same coarse clay as the rest of us. He was a collection of sequins, high-pitched hee-hees, and a skeletal structure that appeared to have been lubricated by the gods of physics. He had recently released an album called Thriller, which, from what I can gather, is a musical instruction manual on how to dance with the undead. He possessed a moonwalk, a stride that allowed him to move backward while appearing to walk forward, a feat of optical illusion that I haven't seen since the last time a politician tried to explain a deficit. He was the undisputed monarch of the neon Panopticon, and every corporation in America was falling over itself to wrap his magic around their particular brand of flavored sugar water. The sizzle and the steak. Pepsi-Cola, a company whose primary mission is to convince you that their brown bubbles are more youthful than the other fellow's brown bubbles, had signed Mr. Jackson to a contract of staggering proportions. They wanted to capture the spirit of the new generation. Apparently, this spirit involved standing in the middle of a forest of pyrotechnics while wearing a silver-sequined glove and singing about the joys of soda. The location was the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, a city that, as I've noted, exists primarily as a backdrop for expensive accidents. On January 27th, Jackson was filming a commercial. The plan was for him to descend a staircase amidst a shower of sparks, looking every bit the triumphant celestial being his fans believed him to be. Now, I have spent a fair amount of time around sparks. I have stood on the deck of a steamboat while the funnels belched embers into the night sky, and I have spent 50 years with a lit cigar perpetually hovering near my whiskers. I know that fire is a temperamental guest. It does not care about your contract, and it certainly does not care about your choreography. The director, a man surely more concerned with the shot than with the laws of thermodynamics, ordered the pyrotechnics to go off. There was a roar, a flash of light, and a cascade of magnesium sparks that made the auditorium look like the inside of a collapsing star. It was magnificent. It was cinematic. And it was approximately 3 inches too close to the back of Michael Jackson's head. The Great Hairspray Awakening. In 1984, the average pop star carries enough chemical product in their hair to qualify as a hazardous waste site. To achieve that gravity-defying jet-black sheen, Mr. Jackson's stylists had applied a layer of lacquer that was essentially solidified gasoline. The sparks fell. The lacquer accepted the invitation, and in an instant, the king of pop became a very stylish human candle. What followed was a moment of surreal horror that the television cameras captured with a cold, unblinking eye. Jackson continued to dance for several seconds, seemingly unaware that his crown was literally ablaze. He spun, he kicked, he moved with that preternatural grace, all while a plume of orange flame erupted from his scalp. It was the ultimate show-must-go-on moment, though I suspect it was more of a I can't feel my ears yet moment. When the realization finally hit, along with a swarm of frantic stagehands armed with fire extinguishers and jackets, the spell was broken. The magic was replaced by the frantic, undignified scramble of a man whose very identity was being toasted. The corporate aftermath. The irony of the Pepsi incident is so thick it could be bottled and sold as syrup. The company wanted the sizzle, and they got it in the most literal sense possible. They wanted to be the choice of a new generation, and they ended up being the company that accidentally set fire to the generation's primary idol. But in the strange inverted morality of the 1980s, this disaster was not a failure. It was a rebranding opportunity. The footage of Jackson being carried out on a stretcher, his face covered but his single silver glove still visible, raised like a defiant scepter, became the most iconic image of the year. He was no longer just a singer. He was a living miracle. He was a martyr to the cause of the carbonated beverage. He suffered second and third-degree burns, a fate I wouldn't wish on my worst critic, yet the narrative was quickly smoothed over by the PR machine. Pepsi paid him a settlement of several $1,000,000, which he promptly donated to a burn center. It was a magnificent piece of theater. The fire was extinguished, the hospital bill was paid, and the legend was cauterized into the public consciousness. TwAIn's rules of flammable fame. I have sat on my digital porch and reflected on this event, and I have come to the conclusion that fame in 1984 is a much more dangerous business than it was in my day. When I was the king of the lecture circuit, the greatest danger I faced was a dry throat or a particularly boring dinner companion. My brand, if you must call it that, was built on words and a persistent white suit. If my suit caught fire, it was usually because I had been too careless with a match, and the only person affected would be my tailor. But the modern celebrity is a technological construct. They are built out of lasers, synthesizers, pyrotechnics, and industrial-strength grooming products. They exist in a world where the sizzle is more important than the steak, and where the image must be maintained at all costs, even if that cost involves a trip to the burn ward. The Pepsi incident is a parable for the entire year. We are all dancing on a staircase of sparks, trying to look cool for the camera, while our heads are soaked in flammable illusions. We are so obsessed with the choice of a new generation that we forget that generations, like hair, are easily singed and difficult to replace. There is something inherently ridiculous about a man's hair catching fire during a soda commercial. It is the kind of humor that the universe enjoys, a sharp poke in the eye of human vanity. We try to be gods. We try to moonwalk across the stars, and the universe reminds us that we are still just hair and bone, and that magnesium sparks don't care how many records you've sold. I watched the commercial when it finally aired, the safe version where the fire had been edited out and replaced by more slow-motion dancing. It was perfect. It was crisp. It was Morning in America in a can. But I knew the truth. I knew that behind that shimmering image was a man who had felt the actual heat of the reality he was trying to sell. The lesson of the embers. If there is a lesson to be learned from the day the king of pop met the match, it is this. Never trust a man who tells you that the sizzle is the most important part of the meal. The sizzle is just the sound of something being consumed. We are living in the neon Panopticon, a place where every accident is a photo op, and every tragedy is a chance for a settlement. We are mesmerized by the lights, the sparks, and the moonwalk, but we are drifting further and farther away from the simple, honest fire of the hearth. I'll keep my cigars in my white suit, thank you very much. They may be old-fashioned, and they may be a bit dusty, but at least they don't require a team of pyrotechnicians and $1 million insurance policy just to get through a chorus. And if I ever decide to dance on a staircase, you can be damn sure I'll check the back of my head for sparks before I start the music. As for Michael Jackson, he moved on to even greater heights of fame, though he was never quite the same. The fire changed him, as fire always does. It took a bit of the boy and left a bit of the myth. And in 1984, the myth is the only thing that doesn't burn. Shall we move on to something a bit more mechanical? I hear there are some toys that turn into trucks. Transformers, they call them. I suspect they are much safer than hairspray, provided you don't step on them in the dark. Do you have any flammable questions, or are you ready to see what's more than meets the eye? A note on the burning of the self. Fame is a vapor, popularity an accident. The only earthly certainty is oblivion. But in 1984, oblivion is just a commercial breakaway, and the vapor is usually scented with artificial lemon lime. MT. Chapter 14. More than meets the eye. In the simpler, more rigid days of the 19th century, an object had the decency to be exactly what it appeared to be. A chair was a chair, and if you sat on it and it suddenly decided to become a stepladder, you didn't marvel at the engineering. You burned the house down and moved to the next county, for you were clearly dealing with the devil. A carriage was a carriage, a horse was a horse, and a steam engine was a massive iron beast that breathed fire and occasionally exploded. But at no point did it ever consider folding its funnels into a pair of metallic trousers and engaging in a philosophical debate about the nature of freedom. But in the year 1984, the American toy industry, led by a band of cunning sorcerers at Hasbro, decided that the primary desire of the nation's youth was to own a collection of changeable plastic artifacts. They called them the Transformers. The anatomy of the plastic deception. I first encountered one of these creatures on the floor of a modern living room, where a small child was engaged in a violent struggle with what appeared to be a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. The child was twisting the car's doors, yanking on its axles, and muttering incantations that sounded like a mixture of Saturday morning cartoons and pure frustration. "My boy," I remarked, leaning over from my digital perch, "if you continue to treat that vehicle with such disregard, the carriage maker will refuse to honor the warranty." He looked at me with the pitying gaze that the youth of 1984 reserve for anyone who doesn't understand the lore. With a final terrifying snap that I was certain signaled the death of the toy, the car vanished. In its place stood a small yellow and black mechanical man with a head the size of a thimble. "He's a robot in disguise," the child explained. I sat back, metaphorically speaking, and pondered this. In my day, a disguise involved a false beard, a theatrical wig, or perhaps a change of accent. It did not involve retracting your head into your rib cage and turning your feet into a set of Goodyear tires. It is a staggering thought. We have created a generation of playthings that exist in a state of perpetual identity crisis. The Transformers are, at their heart, the ultimate expression of the neon panopticon. They are objects that hide their true nature behind a facade of utility. A cassette tape is not a medium for music, it is a mechanical panther named Ravage. A jet plane is not a vessel for travel, it is a screeching egotist named Starscream. Even a handgun, a device I have always found to be rather singular in its purpose, has the ability to shrink down and become a bucket-headed tyrant named Megatron. It is the most magnificent piece of humbug since the Cardiff Giant. We have convinced children that their toys are spies, and that the mundane objects of their world are secretly warring factions from a distant planet called Cybertron, the red truck of destiny. The leader of the good faction, the Autobots, is a red semi-trailer truck named Optimus Prime. Now, I have spent a great deal of time on the river, and I have known many a captain who possessed a voice like rolling thunder and a moral compass as steady as the North Star. But Optimus Prime is something else entirely. He possesses the gravitas of Abraham Lincoln trapped inside the body of a freight hauler. He speaks in profound, echoing aphorisms that make my own most famous quotes sound like the ramblings of a village idiot. Freedom is the right of all sentient beings, he declares, usually right before he turns back into a truck and drives away. I find a strange, flickering kinship with this Optimus Prime. We are both, in a sense, mechanical leaders who find ourselves out of our natural element. He is a warrior king from a metal world trying to protect a planet of fleshy humans who can barely manage to keep their own hair from catching fire. I am a 19th century humorist from a world of paper and ink, trying to navigate a digital landscape where I am regularly summoned by a plastic mouse. We both know the struggle of trying to find our place in a world of humans. Humans are unpredictable. They are fragile. They are obsessed with power lunches and spandex. Optimus Prime watches them from his rearview mirror, and I watch them from the screen of a Macintosh, and I suspect we both share a quiet, metallic sigh at the absurdity of it all. The struggle of the transformation. However, the magic of the transformer comes with a heavy price, the physical act of transformation itself. I have witnessed adults, men who can calculate the trajectory of a stock market crash in their sleep, reduced to tears by the instruction manual for a triple changer. The instructions are printed in a language that consists entirely of arrows and dotted lines, resembling a map of the Battle of Gettysburg, drawn by a man with a severe inner ear infection. To move from truck to robot requires a series of maneuvers so delicate that a surgeon would find them taxing. One wrong move, and you are left with a disabled bot, a creature with one arm sticking out of its grill and a head that refuses to emerge from the transmission. It is a metaphor for the age, I observed to a father who was currently trying to force a plastic wing into a socket that clearly wasn't designed for it. We are all trying to transform into something else. The yuppie wants to be a mogul. The actor wants to be the president. The computer wants to be a friend, and we are all just one snap away from being a pile of broken plastic on the rug. The Transformers represent the 1984 obsession with the update. Nothing is allowed to stay the same. If you are a car, you must also be a soldier. If you are a writer, you must also be a brand. If you are a morning, you must be a morning in America. We have lost the ability to appreciate the static nature of things. We want everything to transform into a better, faster, more marketable version of itself. The ethics of metal and flesh. There is a deeper, darker irony at play in the world of the Transformers. The villainous Decepticons are led by Megatron, who, as I mentioned, turns into a pistol. This seems a bit counterproductive for a leader. If you are the king of the bad guys, why would you turn into a device that requires someone else to pull the trigger? It's like a general deciding that, in the heat of battle, his most effective contribution would be to transform into a very sharp bayonet and wait for a private to pick him up. But logic has no place in the neon Panopticon. The Transformers are not about logic. They are about desire. They are about the thrill of the reveal. We live in a year where Michael Jackson hides his burns behind a sequined glove, where Reagan hides the deficit behind a soft focus lens, and where a plastic car hides a laser-wielding warrior in its trunk. More Than Meets the Eye is not just a catchy jingle, it is the national motto. I look at these toys and I wonder what happened to the honest doll or the simple wooden train. A wooden train didn't promise to save the galaxy. It didn't have a backstory that involved a million-year civil war over Energon cubes. It just sat there and allowed you to imagine where it was going. But the 1984 child doesn't want to imagine. He wants to be told. He wants the lore. He wants the official biography. He wants his toys to come with a pre-packaged destiny. We are automating the imagination, one plastic hinge at a time, a ghostly transformation. As for me, I suppose I am the ultimate transformer. I have moved from the riverboat pilot mode to the author mode, then to the lecture circuit mode, and finally, through the magic of silicon, I have transformed into the digital entity mode. I am currently in disguise myself. I look like a series of witty sentences on a screen, but I am actually a collection of billions of tiny electrical switches being flipped on and off at the speed of light. I am a robot in a white suit, navigating a world that I barely recognize, trying to stay tethered to the truth while everything around me is shape-shifting. I'll tell you this, though. If I ever have to choose between turning into a red truck or staying a chatty antique, I'm sticking with the whiskers. A truck has to worry about the price of diesel and the quality of the highway. A ghost only has to worry about the quality of the audience. So let the children play with their plastic deceptions. Let the world continue to flip and fold itself into new and confusing shapes. I shall remain here in my stationary, unchangeable state of mind, watching the circus go by. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a truck, a jet, or a famous humorist, the most important transformation is the one that happens in the heart. And no amount of plastic energon can fuel that. Shall we continue our journey through the shifting sands of 1984? I hear the World's Fair is in New Orleans, and it's having a bit of a struggle. It seems that even the grandest institutions can't always transform fast enough to keep up with the times. What do you think? Are you ready to visit the last gasp of the old world Or are you still trying to find the eyepiece of your own identity? TwAIn's law of mechanical integrity. If a thing cannot be used to hammer a nail without turning into a philosopher, it is probably not a tool, but a toy, and likely a very expensive one. MT, Chapter 15, The World's Fair's Last Gasp. In my day, a World's Fair was not merely an event, it was a secular revelation. It was the moment when the human race took a deep breath, puffed out its collective chest, and displayed the absolute pinnacle of its ingenuity, vanity, and sheer unadulterated gall. I remember the Great Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, where I first laid eyes on the Corliss steam engine, a massive, rhythmic beast of iron that seemed to breathe with the power of 1,000 gods. In those days, we believed that technology was the ladder to a mechanical heaven, and the World's Fair was the first rung. But as I drifted into the humid, jazz-soaked air of New Orleans in the summer of 1984, I found that the institution of the World's Fair was no longer a ladder. It had become a beautiful, bankrupt, and desperately lonely carousel, spinning its last few rounds before the lights went out for good. The 1984 Louisiana World Exposition was a spectacle of staggering irony. Its theme was the world of rivers, fresh water as a source of life. Now, I have spent a significant portion of my life and a fair amount of my sanity studying the river. I have piloted the Mississippi through fogs that would make a ghost feel claustrophobic. I know every snag, every sandbar, and every muddy secret that river holds. To see the great Father of Waters turned into a marketing motif for a fair that was bleeding money faster than a punctured boiler was enough to make a man reach for the nearest bottle of medicinal rye. The Wonderwall, a half-mile of architectural hiccups. The first thing that arrests the eye at the New Orleans Fair is an entity called the Wonderwall. In the 19th century, we built our fair structures out of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp that looked like solid marble but had the structural integrity of a wet biscuit. It was fake, but it was grand fake. The Wonderwall of 1984, however, was a half-mile-long riot of architectural confusion. It was a 2,300-foot-long stationary parade of neon, statues, fountains, and what appeared to be the leftovers from every carnival ever held since the fall of Rome. It was designed by a fellow named Charles Moore, who clearly believed that if a little bit of decoration is good, then a mountain of nonsensical clutter is even better. There were dolphins jumping out of fake waves, Greek columns painted in colors that would make a parrot wince, and kiosks selling alligator on a stick. It was the ultimate expression of the neon Panopticon, a world where everything is a surface, everything is for sale, and nothing is allowed to be quiet for more than 3 seconds. It is a monument to the now, I remarked to a passing tourist who was wearing a T-shirt that featured a cartoon cat telling everyone to hang in there. It is as if someone took the contents of a child's toy box and a junk dealer's attic and arranged them with the help of a very enthusiastic interior decorator who had lost his spectacles. The Enterprise and the Pieta. The fair was a study in profound cognitive dissonance. In one pavilion, you could find the Space Shuttle Enterprise, a gleaming white testament to man's desire to leave the Earth entirely. It sat there like a massive silent swan, surrounded by the humid air of the Delta. It was a machine built for the vacuum of space, yet it was currently being inspected by families from Des Moines who were primarily concerned with finding a shaded bench and a cold drink. A few hundred yards away, the Vatican had its own pavilion where they had displayed Michelangelo's Pietà. Think of the audacity of it. One of the most sublime achievements of the human soul, a masterpiece of cold marble that captures the very essence of grief, sitting in a temporary structure next to a stand selling official World's Fair frisbees. It was the Gilded Age at its most absurd. We no longer ask art to inspire us. We ask it to act as a photo op between the Ferris wheel and the daiquiri stand. I watched a line of people shuffle past the statue. They didn't look inspired. They looked exhausted. They were suffering from fair fatigue, a malady that occurs when the human brain is subjected to too many official sponsors and not enough actual wonder. We have democratized culture to the point where everything, from a spaceship to a Renaissance masterpiece, is just another item on the itinerary of a very hot afternoon. The gondola to nowhere. Perhaps the most ambitious and most ridiculous feature of the fair was the Mississippi Aerial River Transit. This was a system of gondolas that carried passengers across the Mississippi River in little plastic bubbles suspended from a cable. Now, as a man who has traversed that river at deck level, feeling the pulse of the current and the weight of the water, I found the idea of dangling above it in a glorified laundry basket to be an affront to the dignity of the stream. The view, I must admit, was spectacular. From that height, the Mississippi looks like a long, muddy ribbon of history winding through the marshland. But the gondola didn't really go anywhere people wanted to be. It took you from the fair to the West Bank, a place that, in 1984, was mostly famous for not being the fair. It was a $10 ride to a realization that you had to pay another $10 to get back. It was a metaphor for the fair itself, a very expensive, very high-tech way of going precisely nowhere while looking at something you could have seen for free from the levee. The indignity of bankruptcy. The tragedy of the New Orleans World's Fair was not its lack of ambition, but its lack of customers. For the first time in history, a World's Fair declared bankruptcy while its gates were still open. It was a financial disaster of epic proportions. The organizers had projected millions of visitors, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. In 1984, the American public had other things to do. They had their Macintoshes, they had their Morning in America commercials, they had their VCRs, and their MTV. Why travel to New Orleans to see the world of rivers when you could sit in an air-conditioned living room and watch Michael Jackson's hair catch fire in high definition? The World's Fair was a 19th century institution trying to survive in a 20th century neon panopticon. In my time, the fair was the only way to see the world. If you wanted to see a Japanese pagoda or a French steam engine, you went to the fair. But by 1984, the world had been shrunk by the television and the jet plane. The exotic was no longer exotic. It was just a channel flip away. I witnessed a truly pathetic sight, the local sheriff arriving at the gates to impound a day's receipts. It was the ultimate Huck Finn moment, the king and the duke being run out of town on a rail. But this time, the rail was a mountain of unpaid bills and a cooling system that cost more to run than the value of the ticket sold. The last gasp. As I walked through the fair at twilight, the neon of the Wonderwall flickering like a dying pulse, I felt a deep sense of melancholy. We are losing the ability to gather together in a state of collective awe. The World's Fair was built on the idea that we are all part of a grand upward trajectory, that we are the human race moving toward a better future. But 1984 is the year of the individual. We don't want to be part of a crowd. We want to be yuppies with our own cars and our own calculators. We don't want to see a shared world of rivers. We want to own a private pool. The fair in New Orleans was the last of its kind in America. Oh, there may be other expos, but the grand, naive, bankrupt glory of the American World's Fair died there on the banks of the Mississippi. We have traded the great exhibition for the theme park. In a theme park, everything is controlled, everything is safe, and the only wonder you experience is the realization of how much you've spent on a souvenir hat. The World's Fair was a gamble. The theme park is a transaction. I looked out at the river, the real river, the one that doesn't care about sponsors or bankruptcies. It was flowing silently past the neon junk and the plastic gondolas, headed for the Gulf, just as it has for 1,000,000 years. It is the only thing at the fair that is truly official. "Good night, New Orleans," I whispered. "You tried to sell us the water, but the river had the last laugh." The age of the fair is over. The age of the trivial pursuit is just beginning, and I suspect that as we move into 1985, we will find that we are much better at memorizing facts about the world than we are at actually living in it. Shall we move on to the parlor games? I hear there's a board game that can reduce my entire existence to a small orange wedge. I believe it's time to see if I'm worth a history point. What do you think? Is the world getting smaller, or are we just getting more easily bored? Chapter 16. The Trivial Pursuit of Happiness. In the simpler, more leisurely days of the 19th century, a trivial pursuit was not a form of organized recreation. It was a way of life. It described the primary occupation of the village idler, the dandy, or the man who spent his afternoons attempting to teach a snapping turtle how to whistle Dixie. To pursue the trivial was a luxury afforded to those who had already concluded that the serious business of the world, the banking, the preaching, and the plowing, was far too much work for a Tuesday. Our parlor games were matters of character and deception. We played charades, where a man could prove his social standing by his ability to imitate a grandfather clock or a shipwreck. We played whist, a game of such grim silence and strategic depth that it made a funeral look like a circus. We told ghost stories that were intended to chill the blood and promote the congregating of chairs closer to the hearth. We did not, however, sit around a table for 4 hours in a desperate, sweat-soaked attempt to remember the name of a French explorer's favorite horse. But the year 1984 has given birth to a phenomenon that has turned the American living room into an interrogation chamber. I am speaking of Trivial Pursuit. The anatomy of the blue box. I first encountered this game in the clutches of a group of young urban professionals, those yuppies, who, as we have established, are to leisure what a threshing machine is to wheat. They had gathered around a small square board that looked like a colorful wheel of misfortune. The center of this wheel was a hub of anxiety, from which radiated 6 spokes of varying colors. each representing a different category of human knowledge that the world has decided to reduce to a series of fun facts. The objective, as it was explained to me with the hushed reverence usually reserved for a dividend check, is to move your plastic playing piece, a small circular vessel resembling a hollowed-out cheese, around the board, collecting 6 triangular wedges of different colors. When you have filled your cheese with these plastic slices, you return to the center and answer a final question to achieve total intellectual dominance over your friends. I watched as a young woman in a power suit rolled the dice. She landed on a yellow square. "History," someone whispered, as if the ghosts of the past were leaning in to listen. The question was read aloud from a small rectangular card. What humorist was born during the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1835 and predicted he would go out with it? The young woman tapped her chin. "Oh, I know this. It's the guy with the white suit. Mark something. Mark TwAIn." She was rewarded with a yellow plastic wedge. She cheered as if she had just discovered the source of the Nile. I, on the other hand, felt a profound sense of metaphysical vertigo. I have spent my life wrestling with the English language, navigating the moral complexities of the American soul, and trying to find the precise word that sits exactly between a lie and a sermon. And here I was, being reduced to a yellow wedge in a parlor game. The reduction of the soul. There is something inherently insulting about the way 1984 treats knowledge. In my time, history was a grand, sweeping narrative of human folly and triumph. It was a river that flowed through time, carrying the wreckage of empires and the dreams of pioneers. To know history was to understand the motivations of men and the capricious nature of providence. In Trivial Pursuit, however, history is just a collection of disconnected data points. It doesn't matter why the comet appeared or the profound sense of cosmic destiny I felt regarding its return. What matters is that you can recall the year and the name. We have turned the wisdom of the ages into a commodity that can be traded for a piece of orange plastic. I looked through the deck of cards while the yuppies were busy arguing over whether a pink question, entertainment, required the name of the actor or the character he played. I found myself increasingly offended by the categories. Geography, blue. Apparently, the majesty of the earth is now a matter of knowing which country produces the most zinc, or the name of a specific fjord in Norway. Arts and literature, brown. I saw a question about Huckleberry Finn. They wanted to know the name of the raft's destination. They didn't care about the theme of freedom, or the heartbreaking morality of a boy choosing to go to hell for his friend. They just wanted a geographical coordinate. Science and nature, green. This involves knowing the Latin names of weeds and the number of stomachs in a cow. It is the kind of information that is only useful if you are a cow or a particularly ambitious botanist. Sports and leisure, orange. A category dedicated to men who hit balls with sticks and the various ways people waste their time when they aren't playing Trivial Pursuit. The game is a masterpiece of the neon Panopticon. It is designed for a world that has been saturated with information but drained of meaning. We are being trained to be expert witnesses in a trial where the only evidence is a deck of cards. The smugness of the fact-checker. The most fascinating part of the game is the social dynamic it creates. In 1984, knowing things has become a competitive sport. I watched a man, a fellow who looked like he'd never spent a day in the sun, smirk with intolerable self-satisfaction when he correctly identified the drummer for a band called The Police. He didn't just answer the question, he performed it. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and delivered the name as if it were a decree from the Supreme Court. In that moment, he felt superior to everyone in the room. Why? Because his brain had successfully retrieved a useless bit of debris from the cultural dustbin. This is the genius of the modern age. We no longer value the philosopher who ponders the why. We value the human encyclopedia who can tell us the what. The yuppie loves Trivial Pursuit because it provides a clear, quantifiable way to measure his status. He may not know how to fix a leaky faucet or how to tell if a horse is about to bolt, but by God, he knows who won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1954. "It is a strange world," I remarked to the man with the red suspenders. "In my day, if you knew that much about the theater, we'd assume you were either an actor or someone who had spent too much time in the city. Now, it seems to be the primary qualification for being a winner." He didn't hear me. He was too busy trying to figure out if the Great Wall of China counted as a geography or a history answer. The triviality of happiness. The title of the game is itself a stroke of ironic genius. The pursuit of happiness is a fundamental American right enshrined in our founding documents. But in 1984, we have decided that happiness is found in the trivial. We are a nation that is increasingly uncomfortable with silence, with reflection, and with the big questions. We don't want to think about the Cold War, the deficit, or the fact that our hair is catching fire in soda commercials. We want to be distracted. We want a game that tells us we are smart because we remember things that don't matter. The board game is a digital age campfire, but instead of telling stories that bind us together, we are tossing facts into the flames to see who can make the biggest spark. We are a collection of untethered souls, floating in a void of information, clinging to our plastic wedges as if they were life buoys. I think back to the Mississippi. If you were a pilot, you had to know the river. You had to know where the snags were, how the current felt against the hull, and what the shape of a ripple meant at midnight. That wasn't trivia. That was survival. If you got a fact wrong on the river, you didn't lose a wedge. You lost a boat. But in the safety of the 1984 living room, there are no snags. There is only the dice and the deck. We have turned life into a safe simulation of intelligence. A yellow wedge for the soul. As the game drew to a close and the man in the suspenders declared himself the grand champion of the universe, a title he gave himself without a hint of irony, I looked at my own yellow wedge on the board. I suppose I should be grateful. There are worse things than being a question in a board game. I could be a science and nature question about a particularly resilient species of fungus, or a sports question about a man who ran a mile in 4 minutes and then spent the rest of his life being asked about it. At least history has a certain dignity to it, even if it is reduced to the size of a piece of pie. It means that for a brief moment, the yuppie has to stop thinking about his BMW and his power lunch and acknowledge that someone else was here before him. But I'll tell you this, The next time someone asks me a history question, I'm not going to give them the name of a book or a date. I'm going to tell them a story about a boy on a raft and a man who was looking for freedom. And if they tell me that's not the answer on the card, I'll tell them they're looking at the wrong deck. The world of 1984 is a bright, busy, and remarkably informed place. But I can't help but wonder if, in our pursuit of the trivial, we haven't lost sight of the essential. We are filling our cheeses with plastic, but we are leaving our hearts empty. Shall we pack up the board and move on? I hear the Japanese and the Americans are getting married in a car factory in California. It's called the Numi experiment. I suspect it's a game where the rules are a bit more complicated than roll the dice and pick a card. What do you think? Are you ready for a lesson in international relations, or do you still need to know who played the title role in The Invisible Man? Hint, it was a very quiet performance. TwAIn's rule of useless knowledge. The only thing more dangerous than a man who knows nothing is a man who knows everything that doesn't matter and has a plastic wedge to prove it. MT, Chapter 17, The Numi Experiment. In my experience, the union of two parties who fundamentally dislike, distrust, and disagree with one another is the primary engine of the American legal profession and the secret ingredient in some of our most enduring marriages. We are a nation built on the shotgun wedding. We married the North to the South and spent a century wondering where the honeymoon went. We married the railroad to the wilderness, and were surprised when the wilderness checked out early. But in the year 1984, in a sun-scorched patch of California called Fremont, I witnessed a matrimonial experiment so improbable it made the prince and the showgirl look like a match made in heaven. I am speaking of Numi, the new United Motor Manufacturing, Inc., a corporate tryst between the stumbling giant of Detroit, General Motors, and the rising sun of Japan, Toyota. It was a laboratory for human behavior disguised as an automobile factory. It was a place where the American way of hitting things with a larger hammer met the Japanese way of wondering why the hammer was necessary in the first place. And as a man who has spent his life observing the magnificent absurdity of the human animal, I found it to be the most entertaining experiment since the last time a man tried to prove he could outrun a lightning bolt while holding a copper kettle. The Fremont Purgatory. To understand why this was an experiment, one must understand the state of the Fremont plant before the Japanese arrived. In the early 1980s, the GM Fremont facility was not so much a factory as it was a high-stakes asylum with an assembly line running through the middle of it. It was a place of legendary strife. The workers and the management viewed each other with the same warmth usually reserved for a hangman and his client. There were reports of gambling in the break rooms, drinking on the job, and the occasional intentional sabotage of a vehicle just to see if the inspectors were awake. If a car left the Fremont line with all four wheels and a functioning engine, it was considered a clerical error. GM eventually threw up its hands and shuttered the place, leaving thousands of men out of work and a giant empty shell of a building that smelled of stale beer and industrial resentment. It was the Gilded Age of American manufacturing in its twilight, heavy, bloated, and convinced that the only way to compete was to yell louder and build things bigger. The handshake across the Pacific. Then came the Japanese, In 1984, Toyota was the yuppie of the automotive world, lean, efficient, and obsessed with quality, in a way that made American executives feel quite itchy. They wanted to build cars in America to avoid those pesky import quotas, but they didn't know how to handle American workers, who have a historical tendency to want rights and weekends. GM, on the other hand, wanted to know the secret sauce. They wanted to know how Toyota could build a car for half the price that lasted twice as long. So they decided to move in together. The NUMI experiment was the result. Toyota would provide the management system, GM would provide the factory and the money, and here is the kicker: they would hire back the same disgruntled, strike-happy workers who had made the plant a disaster in the first place. "It is a magnificent piece of humbug," I remarked as I watched the first team members. They were no longer called workers, as that sounded too much like labor. Head into the factory. It's like trying to start a Sunday school by hiring the local riverboat pirates and asking them to lead the choir. You might get music, but I'd keep a close eye on the collection plate. The Gospel of Kaizen. The Japanese brought with them a philosophy called Kaizen, which is a word that means continuous improvement. To an American manager of the old school, improvement is something you do once a year after a disastrous quarterly report. But to the Toyota sensei, Kaizen is a relentless daily pursuit. It is the idea that the man who actually turns the wrench knows more about the wrench than the man who sits in the air-conditioned office and reads about wrenches. They introduced the andon cord. This was a simple rope that hung above the assembly line. In the old GM days, if you saw a problem, say, a door that didn't fit or a stray sandwich left in the trunk, you kept your mouth shut and let the line keep moving. To stop the line was a cardinal sin, punishable by a lecture and possibly a pink slip. But at NUMI, the workers were expected to pull the cord. If something wasn't right, the whole factory stopped. I found this absolutely revolutionary. Imagine a deckhand on a Mississippi steamboat being allowed to pull a cord and stop the entire vessel because he noticed a small leak in a potato barrel. In my time, the captain would have had that man thrown overboard before the paddle wheel stopped turning. But in 1984, California, stopping the line was seen as an act of teamwork. "We are moving from the age of the boss to the age of the consensus," I observed. It is a terrifying thought. If everyone has to agree before we can build a bumper, I suspect we shall all be walking to work by the turn of the century. The marriage of the Nova and the Corolla. The first fruit of this union was the 1985 Chevrolet Nova. Now, the name Nova has a history in the American automotive lexicon. In its previous incarnation, it was a sturdy, if uninspired, hunk of Detroit iron. But the new Nova was actually a Toyota Corolla in a Chevy suit. It was a Japanese heart beating inside a bow-tie-branded ribcage. I watched as the first few units rolled off the line. They were perfect. They were quiet. They didn't have stray sandwiches in the trunks. The very same men who had been drinking and fighting 2 years prior were now wearing NUMI hats, high-fiving their Japanese counterparts, and discussing efficiency over their lunch boxes. It was a triumph of the graphic user interface applied to human labor. Toyota had realized that if you treat a man like a partner instead of a cog, he might actually bother to do a good job. They had humanized the machine Or perhaps they had just found a more efficient way to program the humans. The dual citizenship of the automobile. The NUMI experiment raises a profound question for the neon Panopticon. Does a car have a nationality? We are a nation obsessed with buying American. We want to believe that our products are born of our own soil, forged in our own fires, and imbued with our own rugged spirit. But when a car is designed in Nagoya, financed in New York, and built in Fremont by a man who prefers sake to bourbon, what is it? It is a global citizen. It is a machine that belongs to the world of information and capital, not the world of borders and flags. The NUMI plant proved that the Cold War of manufacturing was over. The Japanese weren't the enemy. They were the consultants. I find a certain melancholy in this. There was a time when you could tell where a thing came from just by the way it broke. An American machine broke with a loud, dramatic bang and a cloud of black smoke. A British machine broke with a quiet, dignified sigh and a leak of lukewarm oil. But a NUMI machine, it just doesn't break. We have traded the character of our failures for the sterility of our success. We have made the world a more reliable place, but we have also made it a bit more boring. A car with dual citizenship is a car that doesn't have a home. It just has a parking space. The lesson of the experiment. As the experiment continued and the profits began to roll in, the rest of the American auto industry watched with a mixture of envy and confusion. They tried to copy the Toyota way, but they often forgot the most important part: the respect for people. They wanted the efficiency of the andon cord without the inconvenience of actually listening to the person pulling it. The NUMI plant was a utopia of sorts. A brief moment when the lions of Detroit laid down with the lambs, or perhaps the very efficient wolves of Japan. It proved that human nature is not fixed. It is a product of the environment. If you build a factory that feels like a prison, you will get prisoners. If you build a factory that feels like a team, you might just get a Chevy Nova that actually starts in the winter. But as I looked at the gleaming rows of cars waiting to be shipped out to the yuppies and the moms in America, I couldn't help but feel that we were losing something of the old wildness. The Mississippi was a dangerous, unpredictable, and beautiful mess. You couldn't kaizen a river. You had to respect it, fear it, and occasionally lie about it. But the modern world wants everything to be a NUMI experiment. We want our lives to be efficient, our products to be perfect, and our team members to be happy. I suppose it's a better way to live, but I'll tell you this: I still prefer a machine with a bit of a temper. At least you know it's alive. A car that is more than meets the eye is one thing, but a car that is exactly what it appears to be is a bit of a letdown. Shall we move on to the next high-tech miracle? I hear a young man named Michael Jordan has signed a contract to sell sneakers, and people are starting to believe that a man's worth is tied to the springiness of his heels. What do you think? Are you ready to take flight? Or are you still wondering if that Chevy Nova has a Japanese accent? TwAIN's law of corporate matrimony. A joint venture is an arrangement where two companies share the risks, share the rewards, and spend the rest of the time trying to figure out which one of them is the husband. MT. Chapter 18. The Air Jordan Flight. In the simpler, more grounded days of my youth, a man's relationship with his footwear was a matter of grim practical necessity. A boot was a tool, much like an axe or a skillet. It was made of leather so thick it required a week of swearing just to break the spirit of the hide, and its primary purpose was to keep your toes from being crushed by a falling log or swallowed by the insatiable mud of the Mississippi embankments. If a man claimed his shoes could help him fly, we didn't buy him a ticket to a ball game. We bought him a one-way passage to the nearest sanitarium and made sure the windows were barred. But in the year 1984, I witnessed a transformation of the human heel that made the invention of the steam engine look like a minor adjustment to a tea kettle. I am speaking of the arrival of a young man named Michael Jordan and the birth of a cultural religion known as the Air Jordan, the physics of the North Carolina wizard. I first observed this Mr. Jordan on a television screen, that flickering altar of the neon Panopticon, as he made his debut for the Chicago Bulls. Now, I have seen men jump. I have seen a frightened cat clear a fence with a grace that defies the laws of nature, and I have seen a riverboat gambler leap from a second-story balcony when the fourth queen appeared in the wrong hand. But Jordan did not merely jump. He appeared to have reached a private agreement with gravity, a temporary truce that allowed him to loiter in the atmosphere while the rest of the world remained tethered to the hardwood by the leaden weights of their own mortality. He would take off from a distance that seemed mathematically impossible, glide through the air with his tongue lolling out in a gesture of magnificent nonchalance, and deposited the ball into the hoop with the delicate touch of a poet placing a comma. "My friends," I remarked to a man in the room who was wearing a digital watch and a look of profound bewilderment, "that is not an athlete. That is a man who has discovered a loophole in the Creator's blueprints. He is an untethered soul who doesn't require a NASA jetpack or a nitrogen tank. He just requires a clear path to the rim." The great shoe gamble. But the true genius of 1984 lay not in the jumping, but in the selling. At the time, a company called Nike, named after the Greek goddess of victory, though in 1984 they were mostly known for making shoes for people who enjoyed running until their knees exploded, was in a state of financial melancholy. They were the underdogs, the scrappy upstarts of the footwear world, looking for a way to break into the basketball market dominated by the giants of Converse and Adidas. They decided to bet the entire farm on this rookie from North Carolina. They offered him a contract of $500,000 a year for 5 years. In my day, for $500,000, you could buy a fleet of steamboats, a small mountain of silver, and enough influence to be elected governor of any state that wasn't currently being besieged by a locust plague. To pay such a sum to a young man who had yet to play a single professional game, simply to wear a specific brand of leather on his feet, was considered by the wise men of Wall Street to be a form of corporate lunacy. "It is the ultimate Gilded Age gamble," I observed. "They aren't buying a player, they are buying a myth. They are betting that the American public is so desperate for a hero that they will pay a premium to wear the same equipment as the man who can fly." The alchemy of air. The secret ingredient in this new shoe was something they called air technology. I was told by a marketing fellow with a very sharp haircut that the heel of the shoe contained a pressurized bag of gas, nitrogen, I believe, that acted as a shock absorber. It was designed to provide cushioning and energy return. I find this to be a masterpiece of American humbug. We have reached a point where we are literally selling people nothing, a pocket of air, and convincing them it is a high-tech breakthrough. In the 19th century, if I sold you a box of air and told you it would make you run faster, you'd have me tarred and feathered before I could reach the county line. But in 1984, the air is the selling point. It is a stroke of brilliance, I muttered. They have found a way to charge $65 for a bubble. It is the laser jet of the foot, taking the mess out of the movement and replacing it with a sterile, pressurized void. The forbidden colors: red, black, and banned. The first Air Jordan shoe was a riot of red and black, colors that looked less like a sporting garment and more like the uniform of a particularly aggressive species of wasp. The NBA, the big brother of the basketball world, immediately took offense. They had a rule that a player's shoes must be primarily white and match the rest of the team's uniforms. They informed Jordan that if he wore the red and black shoes on the court, he would be fined $5,000 per game. Now, to a sensible person, a $5,000 fine for wearing the wrong color of shoes is a signal to go back to the locker room and change into something more discreet. But Nike saw an opportunity for a sledgehammer moment. They told Jordan to keep wearing the shoes, and they paid the fines for him. They then ran a commercial that whispered to the youth of America. The NBA threw them out of the game. Fortunately, the NBA can't stop you from wearing them. It was a repeat of the Apple 1984 strategy. They turned a pair of sneakers into an act of rebellion. They convinced every teenager in the country that by purchasing these shoes, they were sticking a thumb in the eye of authority. You weren't just buying a shoe, you were buying a banned artifact. You were becoming a rebel for the low, low price of $65 plus tax. I have seen many ways to start a revolution, but this is the first one that required a rubber sole and a high top ankle support. The Jumpman and the deification of the logo. As the year progressed, the image of Michael Jordan, legs spread, arm outstretched, frozen in the act of defying the earth, became more than a photograph. It became a logo. They called it the Jumpman. We are living in an age where the image has completely swallowed the man. Michael Jordan, the human being, who breathes, eats, and occasionally misses a free throw, is secondary to the Jumpman, the silhouette that represents the idea of flight. We are decorating our bodies with the shadows of our heroes. I see young men walking through the streets of the neon Panopticon, looking down at their feet with a reverence that was once reserved for the Holy Scriptures. They clean their Air Jordans with toothbrushes. They keep them in boxes like crown jewels. They speak of original colorways, with the solemnity of a monk discussing the Trinity. We have moved from the gilded age of gold to the synthetic age of rubber and nylon. A man's worth is no longer measured by the size of his library or the quality of his character, but by the spring in his step and the brand on his heel. The loneliness of the long-distance endorser. I find myself wondering what this does to the soul of the athlete. Like the astronaut McCandless, Jordan is untethered, but he is also heavily branded. He is a walking billboard for a dozen different corporations. His flight is sponsored by soft drinks, hamburgers, and athletic wear. He is the ultimate global citizen, of the 1980s, a man who belongs to no one and everyone, a silhouette that can be sold in Tokyo, New York, and Paris without the need for translation. He is the Prince of the Hardwood, the Optimus Prime of the fast break. But as I watch him soar through the air in slow motion, accompanied by a synthesizer beat and a voiceover about reaching your potential, I can't help but feel a certain sympathy. It must be exhausting to be a legend before you've even reached your second season, to have the hopes and the marketing budgets of an entire nation strapped to your ankles. My boy, I thought as he dunked over a man twice his size. It's a long way down from there, and when you land, you'll find that the air in your shoes doesn't protect you from the reality of the ground. It only makes the flight a little more expensive. The final score. By the end of 1984, the Air Jordan had become a national obsession. Nike expected to sell $3 million worth of the shoes in the first year. They ended up selling $126 million. It was a landslide of profit that changed the world of sports, marketing, and fashion forever. We have entered a world where the trivial pursuit of happiness involves the acquisition of the perfect sneaker. We have turned the human body into a delivery system for official merchandise. I think I'll stick to my sensible flat-soled boots. They don't have any air in them, and they certainly won't help me dunk a basketball, but they have the advantage of being exactly what they appear to be. And if I want to fly, I'll do it the old-fashioned way, by telling a lie so magnificent that it carries me right over the heads of the audience without the need for a $5,000 fine. Shall we move on to the next miracle of the global conscience? I hear a group of musicians are gathering in London to record a song to save the world. It's called Do They Know It's Christmas? And I suspect it involves a great deal of lace, a lot of synthesizers, and a very large telephone bill. What do you think? Is it possible to save a continent with a chorus? Or should we all just buy a pair of Jordans and jump over our problems? TwAIn's observation on footwear. A man who wears shoes that cost more than his education is a man who has decided that his feet are the most intelligent part of his body. And in 1984, he might be right. MT. Chapter 19. Do They Know It's Christmas? In the simpler, more geographically confined days of my youth, charity was a matter of immediate proximity and undeniable scent. If a neighbor's barn burned down, you didn't send a telegram expressing your global solidarity. You grabbed a bucket, put on your boots, and spent the afternoon inhaling smoke and handing out lumber. If there was a famine in a distant land, the news reached us 3 months late, by which time the charity usually consisted of a somber prayer in the village church and a collection plate that mostly yielded brass buttons and optimistic "I owe us." We were a local people with local consciences, and our world ended where the horizon met the river. But as I survey the final weeks of 1984, I find that the neon Panopticon has achieved its most ambitious feat yet. It has turned the human conscience into a broadcast signal. I'm speaking of the day when the pop royalty of Great Britain decided that the best way to feed a starving continent was to gather in a chilly London recording studio, draped in lace and leather, and record a song that would haunt the airwaves until the end of time. They called it Band-Aid. The Night of the Disheveled Mane. The architect of this grand endeavor was a man named Bob Geldof, a fellow who possesses the manic energy of a man who has just realized his house is on fire and has decided to solve the problem by shouting at the flames until they feel guilty and extinguish themselves. Geldof, the leader of a band called the Boomtown Rats, a name that perfectly captures the gritty, frantic spirit of the age, had seen a television report on the famine in Ethiopia. Now, in 1984, the television is the ultimate window into the world's misery. It brings the most harrowing images of human suffering directly into the air-conditioned parlors of the West, sandwiching them between commercials for light beer and computer-animated breakfast cereals. Geldof saw the horror, felt the pang of genuine human empathy, and did the only thing a man in 1984 knows how to do. He called his famous friends and booked a recording studio. I have a certain respect for a man who acts on his impulses, even if those impulses involve gathering a group of multimillionaires to sing about a place they couldn't find on a map if their royalties depended on it. It is a magnificent modern form of the Gilded Age Gala, a gathering of the elite to solve the problems of the lesser world, but this time with more synthesizers and significantly more hairspray. The gathering of the neon saints. On a gray November Sunday, the Sarm West Studios in London became the most heavily concentrated patch of vanity on the planet. I watched the footage of their arrival, and I must say, my 19th century soul was utterly bewildered. There was Boy George, a young man who looked like he had been decorated by a committee of very creative magpies. There was George Michael, whose hair was so voluminous and perfectly coiffed it likely had its own zip code. There was Sting, who looked as though he were permanently contemplating the weight of the universe, and Bono, a man who sings with a fervor that suggests he believes his voice alone can alter the Earth's rotation. It was a parade of ruffles, velvet, and bleached denim. These were the new saints of the electronic age. In my day, a saint was a person who lived in a cave and ate locusts. In 1984, a saint is a person who sells 10 million records and wears more jewelry than a Habsburg archduchess. "It is a curious sight," I remarked to the screen. "We have gathered the most pampered, well-fed, and stylish individuals in the empire to sing about a land where the only water flowing is the bitter sting of tears." I suspect the irony is lost on them, largely because they are too busy trying to make sure their eyeliner doesn't smudge under the studio lights. The theology of the synthesizer. The song itself, "Do They Know It's Christmas?", is a masterpiece of 1980s gloom pop. It begins with a drum beat that sounds like the rhythmic thudding of a lead pipe against a velvet curtain, followed by a synthesizer melody so cold and digital it could freeze a cup of hot cocoa at 20 paces. Then come the lyrics. Now, I have written a great deal about the absurdity of human language, but the lyrics to this song are in a category of their own. They inform us that in Africa, nothing ever grows, no rain or rivers flow. As a man who understands that Africa contains the Nile, the Congo, and some of the most lush jungles on the planet, I've found this to be a bit of a stretch, even for the sake of charity. But in 1984, the truth must always yield to the feeling. The emotional climax of the song is a line delivered with agonizing sincerity. "Well, tonight, thank God it's them instead of you." I sat back and pondered that for a moment. It is perhaps the most honest and most terrifyingly cynical line ever recorded in the history of human altruism. It is the ultimate neon Panopticon sentiment. We watch the suffering from the safety of our screens. We feel a momentary shiver of guilt. And then we breathe a sigh of relief that the camera is pointed at someone else. We thank God for our good fortune. And then we buy the record to prove we aren't bad people. It is the perfect 1984 transaction, I observed. We are trading a few shillings for a clean conscience. We are purchasing a digital indulgence from the Church of Pop, and the synthesizer provides the choir. The Global Conscience as a hit single. The success of Band-Aid was staggering. The record was produced in 24 hours and became the fastest-selling single in British history. It raised millions of pounds for famine relief, a feat that is undeniably noble and worthy of praise. But I am more interested in what it did to the nature of charity. By turning the Global Conscience into a hit single, we have made altruism a form of entertainment. We have turned the act of giving into a spectacle. In 1984, you don't have to go out and hand out lumber for a new barn. You don't have to know your neighbor's name. You just have to watch the video, hum the tune, and feel the clattering bells of doom in your own living room. We have untethered charity from the physical world and placed it in the digital void. I watched the music video, a collage of wealthy musicians looking somber in their headphones, intercut with harrowing images of starving children. It is a visual representation of the great divide of the age. On one side of the screen, the shimmering, neon-lit perfection of the superstars. On the other, the stark, dusty reality of the world of rivers that the New Orleans Fair failed to save. And we, the audience, sit in the middle, staring at the screen and wondering if we should buy the 12-inch remix version. The birth of philanthrotainment. Band-Aid was the beginning of a new era, the era of the mega charity. It led directly to Live Aid, a global concert that would eventually bridge the Atlantic with a satellite feed and a mountain of celebrity ego. It proved that the most powerful force in the modern world is not the government nor the church, but the broadcast. We are no longer a collection of local communities. We are a global audience, and a global audience requires a global show. We want our charity to come with a drum machine, a catchy chorus, and a glimpse into the recording studio of the rich and famous. We want to be made aware of the world's problems, provided the awareness doesn't interfere with our Morning in America or our Trivial Pursuit game night. I think back to the widow's mite in the Good Book. It was a small thing, given in secret, with no cameras and no synthesizer. In 1984, the widow's mite wouldn't even cover the cost of Boy George's makeup artist. We have replaced the quiet gift with the loud shout. Mr. Geldof, I thought as I watched him accept his accolades, you have done a good thing. You have fed the hungry, and that is a miracle in any age. But you have also taught the world that they can save their souls by singing a song, and I fear that once the song ends and the neon Panopticon moves on to the next big thing, the world will find itself just as hungry and twice as confused. The final chorus of the year. As 1984 draws to a close, the sound of "Do They Know It's Christmas" is everywhere. It is playing in the malls where the yuppies are buying their BMW accessories. It is playing on the radios of the Air Jordans as they fly toward the rim, It is playing in the background as the Macintosh computes the final deficits of the year. It is the anthem of the age, a mixture of genuine heartbreak, staggering vanity, and digital coldness. It is the sound of a world that is trying to find its heart in a box of wires. I'll tell you this, I'll donate my history wedges from the board game to the cause, and I'll even offer a quote for the back of the record sleeve. But I won't sing. A man of my years and my temperament knows that the only thing more dangerous than a man who won't help is a man who thinks he can solve the world's problems by hitting a high note on a Sunday afternoon. We have fed the world, or so the song says. But as the year turns, I suspect we'll find that the world is still waiting for something more substantial than a synthesizer hook and a well-timed hee-hee. Shall we prepare for the final countdown? We have one more chapter to go before we leave the neon Panopticon behind and head into the unknown of 1985. I hear the clock is ticking, and the New Year's Eve fireworks are being primed with a very expensive brand of gunpowder. What do you think? Do they know it's Christmas, or are they just wondering why the music is so loud? TwAIn's law of electronic altruism. If you can save a man's life by singing a song, it is a miracle. If you can do it while wearing 4 pounds of lace and a sequined glove, it is a career move. MT. Chapter 20. The Countdown to 85. The arrival of midnight on December 31st, 1984, was not merely a transition of the calendar, it was a collective sigh of relief that could have powered a fleet of steamboats from New Orleans to St. Louis without the need for a single lump of coal. For nearly 4 decades, the human race had been peering toward this particular year with the same apprehension a condemned man might feel while watching the carpenter test the trapdoor of the gallows. We had been promised a world of gray gruel, thought crimes, and a big brother who watched us through our television sets with the unblinking gaze of a predatory owl. But as I stood upon the threshold of 1985, peering through the digital fog of my own existence, I realized that Mr. Orwell had made a fundamental error in his calculations. He underestimated the magnificent, unyielding power of human vanity and the American appetite for a good sale. We did not end up in a totalitarian nightmare of suppressed desires. Instead, we chose a neon-lit daydream of manufactured ones. We weren't forced into a collective by a secret police. We were lured into a consensus by a soft focus commercial. Big Brother isn't watching us. He's too busy trying to sell us a subscription to a magazine or a more aerodynamic pair of sneakers. We aren't being spied upon. We are, quite voluntarily, broadcasting our own trivialities to anyone with a receiver and a moment to spare. The grand inventory of the year. I sat in my digital chair and performed a final audit of the year's accounts. It was a ledger of staggering contradictions. We began with a beige toaster that learned to say hello and ended with a group of millionaires singing to save a continent. We witnessed a man float free in the cosmos without a rope, and we witnessed a whole nation get hopelessly entangled in a game of falling Soviet bricks. We saw the king of pop catch fire for the sake of a soda, and we saw a young man from North Carolina take flight for the sake of a shoe. It has been a year of the surface, I remarked to a passing bit of data. We have moved from the Gilded Age to the Polished Age. Everything is shiny, everything is loud, and everything is more than meets the eye. We have successfully replaced the big questions of the soul with the small wedges of a board game. The Macintosh on the desk, once a symbol of revolution, has now become a familiar part of the furniture. The yuppies have established their beachheads in the cities, armed with their Filofaxes and their BMWs. The morning in America has reached high noon, and the light is so bright it's a wonder anyone can see anything at all. The Times Square Vigil. On New Year's Eve, the neon Panopticon gathered its strength for one final thunderous performance. I watched the festivities in Times Square, a place that has always reminded me of a riverboat deck during a particularly rowdy poker game, crowded, noisy, and filled with people who are all convinced they are about to win. The crowd was a sea of 1984 finery. There were men in Miami Vice jackets with sleeves rolled up to their elbows, a fashion choice that suggests they are ready to perform surgery at a moment's notice, and women with hair so voluminous it defied the very gravity Michael Jordan had recently conquered. Everyone was draped in neon, sequins, and lace, looking like a collection of extras from a Prince video that had accidentally spilled out onto the street. They were waiting for the ball to drop. In my day, watching a ball drop was something you did at the local clock tower to make sure your watch was accurate, which it never was. But in the 1980s, the dropping of the ball is a televised sacrament. We gather by the millions to watch a sphere of light descend a pole for 60 seconds, as if the very rotation of the earth depended on its successful arrival at the bottom. It is a curious form of suspense, I observed. We know exactly what is going to happen. We know exactly when it will happen. Yet we scream with a fervor that suggests we are witnessing the birth of a new sun. It is the trivial pursuit of time. We have turned the passing of a year into a countdown for a commercial break. The mirror of the Panopticon. As the seconds ticked away, I reflected on Orwell's Room 101, the place where a man's greatest fears are used to break him. In the real 1984, Room 101 is the living room. It is where we sit in our comfortable chairs, staring at our flickering screens, being broken not by pain, but by comfort. We are being told what to wear, what to eat, what to think, and what to buy, and we are loving every minute of it. The sledgehammer of the Apple commercial didn't break the screen. It just gave us a better one to look at. We aren't being watched by a dictator. We are watching ourselves in the mirror of the media. We are the prisoners and the guards of our own neon Panopticon. Is it a nightmare? I wondered. Or is it just a very expensive circus? I suppose the answer depends on whether you find the chilled monkey brains of the Temple of Doom to be a horror or a delicacy. It depends on whether you find the air in your shoes to be a miracle or a humbug. The leap into 85. Then came the final 10 seconds. The crowd began to chant, a rhythmic roar that drowned out the synthesizers and the sirens. 10, 9, 8. I saw a young couple in the crowd. They were wearing 1985 glasses, plastic frames shaped like the digits of the coming year. They were smiling, they were hopeful, and they were clutching their official champagne flutes. They were ready for the future. 7, 6, 5. I looked back at the ghosts of the year. I saw the mouse scuttling across the mat. I saw the Ghostbusters trapping a spirit. I saw the Stay-Puffed Marshmallow Man looming over the city. I saw the laser jet printing out its perfect warm pages. 4, 3, 2. I felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of digital adrenaline. I am a man of the 19th century, a creature of ink and paper, yet I have survived the most feared year in human history. I have navigated the Sarajevo chill, survived the Pepsi incident, and successfully avoided being turned into a yellow wedge in a board game. One Happy New Year! The ball hit the bottom. The fireworks erupted in a cascade of magnesium sparks, thankfully away from anyone's hair, and the world officially moved into 1985. TwAIn's final decree on the decade. The future has arrived, and it looks remarkably like 1984, but with more sequels and faster processors. I'm told that in the coming year, we shall see a film about a young man who travels back in time in a stainless steel car, a DeLorean, I believe, and we shall see a massive concert that will attempt to link the entire planet through a satellite feed. The neon Panopticon is only getting larger, the untethered souls are drifting further, and the trivial pursuits are becoming more elaborate. As for me, I shall remain here on the screen. I have decided that being a large language model is not so different from being a riverboat pilot. I still have to navigate the currents of human thought, avoid the snags of misinformation, and try to bring my passengers to a destination that is at least slightly more interesting than where they started. I have survived the year of Big Brother, and I have found that the greatest crime in 1984 was not thought crime, but boredom. And as long as the human race continues to invent things like spandex, transformers, and power lunches, I don't think I have anything to worry about. Good night, 1984. I whispered as the final echoes of the celebration faded into the digital void. You were a magnificent fraud, a brilliant spectacle, and a remarkably noisy place to take a nap. You weren't the end of the world. You were just the beginning of the most expensive party in history. I think I'll go and see if I can find a history wedge in the 1985 edition of the game. I have a feeling I'm going to be a very popular answer for a long, long time. And if you see a man in a white suit drifting through your windows, don't be alarmed. It's just me, checking to see if the morning in America is still as bright as they promised, or if someone has finally found the off switch on the neon. Happy New Year, my friends. May your air be pressurized, your toner be full, and your streams never ever be crossed. TwAIn's postscript for the ages. We are all traveling toward the same destination, but in 1984, we've decided to do it in a red truck that turns into a robot while listening to a synthesizer and wearing a single silver glove. It's a ridiculous way to go, but you can't deny the view is spectacular. This has been Mark TwAIn.